Good morning. I want to call this meeting to order of the House Energy, Utilities, and Telecommunications Committee. I appreciate the committee members who are here. Coach, no place up here. Won't you come up a little further? Okay. I know that there'll be some members having to come and go as the morning progresses. I wanted to call this meeting for educational, informative purposes for the committee and myself related to the proposed carbon rule by the EPA. A lot of information to try to gather, try to understand, and I think some members of the committee have more expertise, and they've dealt with it more so far than others. But I think that all of us have. I know that I have a lot of questions about it, and there's a lot I don't understand about it, especially as it relates to. Of course, this is all documented, but as far as it relates to dates, I believe the date for testimony before the EPA is probably ended. I think that ended the 1st of this month, but maybe not.
They've extended to the 1st of December.
Okay, it's been extended to the 1st of December. That's good. So some of these, what the dates are, when the EPA will make its final decision, dates that certain things have to be accomplished per the rule, what the states have to do, what the state of Georgia is required to do under the rule if the rule is approved and goes into effect. Who will manage that? Who will manage what the state of Georgia does? What we do have to do? Is there anything? Who has authority to take any action in the state of Georgia? If they have authority, under what authority are they taking action? Does the General Assembly need to give any agency more authority, take authority away? All these questions that we have, and so we have three presentations, and then it will be open for the public comment. But we have presentations from two people from the state EPD, and then we have a gentleman, I believe, from Georgia Tech who's going to make a presentation. And then the meeting is scheduled to go until noon, and I want then for as many people from the public who want to comment on this and offer testimony as possible to do that. And if you haven't signed up yet, if you will, I'm sure we have a sign-up sheet someplace. Leo, where are you? Oh, there you go. The sign-up sheet's right over there. But at noon, we'll cut off. It'll end at noon, and I'm not necessarily going to try. I don't know how many people will sign up to testify. I'm not going to necessarily try to allot time to get everybody to testify. I want everybody to have some ample time to present what they want to present. I don't want to give everybody 30 seconds. That may not even be the case at all. It may not be required. So I think, having said that, I would like to. I don't normally do this, but we have so many things going on in this country and this world. I'd like to open the meeting up with just a short moment of prayer. Father, be with us this morning in these proceedings. Be with each member of the committee, everybody in this room, the people who will present, the people who will testify. We ask you to be with the President of the United States when we have so many problems in the world, Ebola, insurrections and wars in parts of the world, especially in the Middle East. We ask you to put a special blessing upon him. We ask you to be with the governor of the state as he continues to lead the state in the right direction with education and economic development and so many wonderful things that has happened in this administration. And we ask that today this be an informative time when we listen and gain information as we move forward and consider the consequences of pollution in the air and things that have to be done and people's health and all the things that need to be addressed as we move forward. I ask you to be with us in Christ. Amen. With that, I'm going to break the agenda just a little bit. We have Commissioner Stan Wise, and I know Stan has to be someplace, and he said he'd be very brief. And Commissioner Wise, if you would come up and. Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much. I appreciate the accommodation. You have, I think, expressing 4 or 5 of the concerns that we have with the Public Service Commission and where we're going with this as well. One of them I think you addressed and was acknowledged, and that we asked for an extension of time for comment. She has recently granted that. I'm not going to take credit for that, although I did ask for that in my letter to her. We're very concerned about the impact of the potential closure of coal-fired generation in our state. We have, in anticipation of these rules and these changes that are coming out of Washington, been closing plants, and we've made considerable progress toward that. In fact, several years ago, the generation mix in this state was about 60% coal. It's down to close to 35%, and that comes from the actions that we've taken to close, at considerable expense, coal plants. And we're not getting credit for that. Georgia's not getting credit for that in the proposed rule, and we think that's inappropriate. We'd like to get credit for the significant investment that all of Georgians have made to go ahead and make that happen. We're very concerned that the efficiency rate that they're talking about using natural gas is also incorrect and wrong. And we've asked for relief on that. And most importantly, moving toward this end, as everyone is aware, we're developing the next generation of nuclear power in our state. It is a significant investment, and we don't believe that the EPA has given credit for the MEAG, Oglethorpe, Dalton, and Georgia Power's investment in that next generation of nuclear power for safe, clean, emission-free nuclear power. And so that's it in a nutshell. We're continuing to work with the EPD, our staff and EPD. I've met with them. We've talked. We're continuing to address that. We're continuing to look at the legal ramifications of challenges to a potential rule. The state has been very careful about that. I'm pleased with that. The governor, through the EPD, Attorney General Sam Olens, have all been very careful as we proceed, and consistent with what a federal judge ruled this week is opposing some of the legal challenges. It's not appropriate at this time because the rule is not final. And I believe that the judiciousness of the governor and the EPD, Attorney General Sam Olens and the commission, and many of the generators in our state have been correct in not addressing that. But it's important. It's expensive what they're proposing. We're not getting credit for what we've done, is it in a nutshell, whether it's the development of nuclear power or the closure of our coal plants or the investment we've made to make the coal plant we do have in place more efficient and more emission-free than it's ever been. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate your coming here today. Okay, with that, I'll go ahead and proceed with the agenda, the program, and I believe we have, and I'm sorry I haven't met some of these people. We have a gentleman here from EPD. I have a lady here from EPD. If you would introduce yourself and tell us what your position, what you do with the EPD, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. Good morning. I'm Mary Walker. I'm the Assistant Director at EPD. And we also have with us Keith Bentley, who's the Chief of the Air Protection Branch. And we're going to sort of tag team this morning to talk about 111D. We appreciate the opportunity to talk about this proposed rule. As you know, in June, EPA put out a proposed rule to regulate carbon emissions at existing power plants. And the talking point that we heard in June was that this was going to be a 30% reduction in carbon emissions off a 2005 baseline. And that really is true as sort of a mathematical expression of the totality of the reductions in the nation, but it doesn't fully capture the way the rule was structured for an individual state, and it doesn't really capture the impact in Georgia. Because what the rule actually does is establish an individual target state by state, and Georgia's reduction target is substantially more than 30%. It's actually 46% reduction over the time period. So the rule does heavily impact Georgia, as Commissioner Wise noted. Why that is really based on the statutory authority that EPA is using to set this rule. Traditionally, in air regulation, the Clean Air Act establishes these sort of listed pollutants, and EPA sets a standard, an emission standard for those, and then we permit individual facilities and their use of technology to meet those standards. And so that's usually a flat rate across the nation that everybody strives to meet. The difference with carbon is not a listed pollutant in the Clean Air Act. And so EPA has had to use this different authority under 111D, which requires sort of a different regulatory structure and has put in place this mechanism that has led to different targets state by state. Keith is going to go through in detail how that works for Georgia, but it does have a substantial impact here, and we have been heavily focused on understanding how the target's calculated and commenting so that Georgia's target is fair and achievable and doesn't disadvantage us. Okay. In doing this, because of the number of factors that the target considers, it's not just looking at emissions from an individual source. The proposed rule takes into consideration the use of renewables, how we deploy our energy fleet, and it takes into consideration energy efficiency. And these are sort of things that have been outside of our traditional regulatory box. So we've been working very closely with the PSC and with GFA as partners to really effectively respond to the rule, so that Georgia's can most effectively address our target. We know, I think Commissioner Wise referenced the fact that we know that legal questions will be raised about the rule. There already have been suits filed, and we expect that additional suits, will be filed in the future that may affect the ultimate outcome, or certainly and maybe the timeline of the rule. That said, the target that's set for Georgia in that rule is impactful, and we are still in the comment period, and we've been focused very heavily on making sure that we comment effectively so that the state's investments to date in our energy fleet, and particularly in Plant Vogtle, are really reflected, because that's a big investment we as a state have made, and we want to be able to help that zero emissions technology investment count towards our target. So broadly speaking, what the rule establishes is a target emissions rate for each state. So each state has a certain amount of carbon that they're going to be able to emit for every megawatt hour of energy that we generate. Georgia's target that's set for 2030 is 834 pounds of carbon for every megawatt hour of energy. This is in contrast to Alabama's rate, which is 1059. Tennessee's is like 1163. And in Kentucky, the rate that they're going to have in 2030 is over 1,700. So there's wide variation here, and it really is a function of how this rule is structured and how the targets are calculated. So we've been very heavily focused on working with PSC and GFA on understanding the calculation and commenting on it so that Georgia's target is appropriate. I'm going to very broadly talk about the calculation, which is very complex, and many of us had to hear it multiple times. I'm going to broadly talk about it and then turn it over to Keith, who's got a detailed presentation to walk through it. Broadly speaking, what EPA did was they took our fleet as of 2012, and they applied this sort of system of emissions reductions. And so they applied sort of 4 steps to our emissions in 2012 that included investments in existing coal plants, increased use of natural gas, increased use of renewables, and energy efficiency measures. And at each step, as they applied those sort of factors, they sort of ratcheted down our target emissions to come up with their goal for us for 2030. The important thing to note is that they used the baseline year of 2012. As of 2012, the state had already invested a substantial amount of money in conversions to natural gas, and very notably in Plants Vogtle, units 3 and 4 at Plants Vogtle. And so the fact that that was baked into the baseline means that we're not really able to use it to get credit for all that investment that Georgia ratepayers are making in this zero emissions fuel technology. We have already provided comments to EPA. We've been working with them also in conjunction with South Carolina, which is in a very similar situation, to try to communicate that this is very challenging for the state and really doesn't give us credit for this investment that we've made. We're continuing to work with our partners to kind of comment on these rules. I'm going to turn this over to Keith in just a second to go over this. I guess the bottom line of this rule is that it is very technically complex. Each state has an individual target that is very different. We are focused heavily on communicating with EPA the impact of the target on us and trying to influence our target in a positive way to reflect the investments that the state has already made. And lastly, in doing this, we're working closely with our partners. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Keith, and he's got a good presentation.
All right, thank you. Have you concluded, or are you going to come back up?
I think I'm done.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
That's up to y'all.
Yes, sir. If you would introduce yourself and tell us what your position is with the EPD, we'd appreciate it.
Yes, sir. I'm Keith Bentley. I'm Chief of the Air Protection Branch at Georgia EPD. And the Air Branch is the part of the EPD that basically has responsibility for dealing with this rule. Okay. Just a little background. There's been a number of legal challenges back and forth about EPA having authority to regulate greenhouse gases, and at least at this point and all that, they do. It has a lot of. It started with, I guess, with mobile sources, and but all the sort of how that all gets implemented and the degree of authority they have is still, I guess, some subject to question. What EPA has done relative to point sources, major emission sources, is they proposed a rule for new power plants, which was proposed in January this year, and that rule is not yet final. And then they have proposed this rule for existing sources, which is the one we're dealing with, so-called 111D. And that 111D section it refers to a section of the Clean Air Act, which is supposed to cover pollutants that aren't regulated under other parts of the rules, either hazardous or criteria pollutants, in a source that would be covered by a new source performance standard if it were new. So that's how 111D is structured, and it hasn't been used a lot historically. So that is why there's a lot of question about how that should be applied. Here's the timeline that we're looking at now. EPA came out with their 111D proposal in June of 2014. That comment deadline is currently December 1. That was extended from October 15th. The expectation is that EPA will issue the final rule next June, and then states would have until June 2016 to submit a plan to EPA. There's a couple of provisions in there under certain conditions where a state could get a 1 or a 2 year extension on that. We're looking at all that, and it sort of depends on the approach you take and what might be required to put a plan in place. There's an interim goal that we're supposed to achieve on average between 2020 and 2029. And then a final goal would be achieved in 2030, and it's a 3-year average goal. The likely legal challenges, which Mary referred to, I think are commonly acknowledged. There will be legal challenges. How that plays out is kind of anybody's guess at this point. So we're kind of focused right now on trying to make the rule as it's presented and proposed something that we can implement in Georgia. How EPA set these state goals, as Mary said, each state has a different goal. We've had a lot of discussions with EPA and a lot of meetings, and while they are receptive to comments on certain parts of the rule, they seem very determined to stick with this process for how to set the goals. So you take the 2012 fossil-fired units in the state. So that's natural gas and coal. You take the CO2 emissions from those units and you divide it by the megawatts of generation from those units. So that is sort of your baseline number. And then in the numerator, which is the emissions, you add what you can reduce through heat rate improvement and redispatch, basically using more gas resources, burning more natural gas, less coal. And then you, in the denominator, you're adding new generation that does not have carbon emissions, like the nuclear, renewables, solar, wind, and energy efficiency. So that's the basic formula for how they calculated all this. As Mary said, each state goal is different. For Georgia, that 2012 baseline number was 1598 pounds per megawatt hour, pounds of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour. Then they put it through the formula here, and are looking at the green columns on the far right there. The Georgia interim goal is 891 pounds per megawatt hour. That's what we have to meet as an average between 2020 and 2029, and the final goal is 834. One of the things we did early on was to try to figure out where we're going, because a lot of things are happening with the utilities outside this rule, the changes that we've talked about, changes to natural gas, reduction of closure, actually, some of the coal-fired plants, and the Vogtle units coming online. So sort of what we call business as usual, things that are already announced. Where would that take us? And that's the blue column there. So we think in 2020, under things already announced, and the list of them are right there, what we've included is about 1170. So still quite a difference there. So that's kind of where we think we'd end up in the absence of a rule. As far as the individual building blocks, this is kind of a busy slide, but you have to kind of go through them one by one. The first one is the fuel efficiency or the heat rate improvement. EPA based their building block on a 6% improvement. They applied that nationally. Where we are in Georgia right now, we don't really know exactly, but we don't believe we have that 6% improvement. It may be 1 or 2% improvement we could achieve. Natural gas utilization. We do have some underutilized natural gas facilities in Georgia. In 2012, we're running about 51% versus the 70% that's in the target. There are some concerns with that. Obviously, gas is used to ramp up and ramp down a lot faster, so it's used to handle the peak demands. There's some contractual issues that some of the utilities have, and then we're looking at demand growth, infrastructure, things like that. Do we have pipeline capacity, things like that? So there's some constraints there. The nuclear under construction is certainly the issue we've been focused on the most early on, because it is such a significant investment for the state. And as Mary said, the way the rule is structured, they just assume that since those decisions were made prior to 2012, they just put it in the baseline. So I'll talk some more about that in a few minutes. Certainly, those nuclear units play a big role in whatever our actual pounds per megawatt hour are. And then renewable energy, that's the solar, wind, and biomass. In 2012, that was about 3% of the total generation in the state, and that's mostly, well, it is biomass and solar. And EPA's target is 10%. Again, there's issues with renewable in terms of it's not available all the time, and how that plays into for the utilities managing that, as well as just how much of it that you can put in place. And then the energy efficiency programs, basically that comes across as avoided generation. In 2012, we were at 0.6% as a savings as a percent of retail sales, and the EPA target is 9.8%. So there's a lot of questions around that about how you measure and certainly enforce that in an air rule. One thing to note is, because people tend to focus on these individual building blocks, say, well, we can't do that one. We're not required to do any of these in particular by the rule. We're just required to achieve that overall reduction. As a point of fact, you would have to do many of these things, but there are some other things. For example, conversion of coal and natural gas is not on here as a building block, but if we do that, we do get credit for that. So there are some other things you can do, but still it is a stretch. This is kind of another way of showing sort of what's been going on historically in Georgia. This is from going back to 2004 to 2013. This just shows the energy mix from our utilities. And you can see that natural gas has gotten a lot bigger, the green bar there, and coal has come down. We have a dotted line in here. The blue at the bottom is the existing nuclear, and you see that dotted line, how much would be added by Vogtle 3 and 4. So you get an idea of sort of where it's going. And over that time period, that's about a 33% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions due to these changes. In terms of the plan approval that we have to submit to EPA, these are sort of the high-level requirements. We have to have enforceable measures. We have to have an emission performance level, obviously for the utilities, and then we have to have a method to quantify and verify that emissions performance, and then have a system for reporting and corrective actions. If we don't submit an approvable plan, EPA will implement a plan. There'll be a federal plan. What we've been doing so far, we obviously, as Mary said, have been working with a lot of people, having a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions to understand the proposal details and learning a lot about the electric power infrastructure. There's complexity on both sides of that. There's obviously the power infrastructure is very complex, and this rule is very complex. So we've been on a pretty steep learning curve. We've had meetings with EPA. We have those almost weekly, some kind of webinar or phone call. We meet with utilities regularly. We had a meeting with some Georgia Power folks yesterday. We've met with EMCs, the PSC staff, and GFA, other states, to see how they're keeping up with this, and a lot of the other environmental groups and other people who have an interest in this rule. We've had a couple of stakeholder meetings. We had one August 6th and another one on September 19th, and we have some more scheduled so people can come in and talk about, we set it up to talk about certain parts of the rule, so we kind of let people present information. So kind of bring everybody up to the same level of understanding of what's out there. Some of our major issues, the under construction nuclear is certainly our big one. It only applies to 3 states. There's only 3 states that have nuclear power plants currently under construction. That's Georgia, Tennessee, and South Carolina. It's about a $14 billion investment in Georgia, and the fact that the way the proposed rule is structured, we don't get credit for that, is really problematic. We've had several discussions. We had some meetings with EPA and some of their senior people, as well as we submitted some written comments on September 16th. I think we certainly have delivered that message, and EPA has heard it. I feel like they're going to do something with that, but certainly what they will do would be is kind of unknown at this point. And if we got full credit, which is what we asked for in our comments for the zero carbon generation, then the Georgia's goal changes from 834 to about 967. So that's a significant difference there. So basically, if we take it out of the baseline, but then are able to use the credit towards the goal, then that's a big difference for us. Some of our other major issues and questions, we certainly are coordinating across our state agency regulatory authorities. What is PSC authority versus EPD versus GFA? Dispatch of natural gas. How do we structure a rule to shift dispatch between utilities serving different customers? Because it's not just Georgia Power, obviously, it's Oglethorpe, MEAG have some of these resources. So it's a very complicated structure. The rule does allow for us to change the goal from a rate base, the pounds per megawatt hour, to a mass base, just total tons of carbon. So we have that option. At this point, it's not clear on even how to do the calculation conversion. So we haven't evaluated that too much yet, but that would be a way we could go. We get asked a lot. In the rule, it does allow a multi-state approach, a regional approach. I think as far as some other states, other regions of the country are looking at that pretty hard. We haven't really gotten into that very much at this point. I think most of the southern states are in the same boat as us, where it's complicated enough to try to understand how to do it within our own state, much less how we would do any kind of multi-state. We don't even know if it's a good idea, and certainly is it practical in the time frame allowed. The interim goal timeline is too compressed. We need a glide path. That interim goal is so tight, we would have to do the bulk of the reductions by 2020. I think, again, we're hearing some potentially positive response from EPA. They're hearing that certainly across the country. So we might get some relief on that. And then the whole idea of we're setting up a rule to regulate basically our utility industry to hit a target in 2030. And I think any of us can appreciate that predicting what the energy situation is going to be in 2030 is pretty difficult. So we have to have some way to amend the plan if there's some big change or shift in the energy markets. On renewable energy generation, and that was the bulk of the meeting we had with Georgia Power yesterday, is to talk about that. But did EPA get that renewable energy basis right? It's really the number they picked was based on a renewable portfolio standard in North Carolina, and they set that as the basis for the Southeast. We believe they didn't get that exactly right. They misinterpreted that rule. So, and I think they've more or less acknowledged that, but that will make some difference in the number. Certainly solar, as you know, is taken off here in the last few years in Georgia. So the question is really, how much solar can you do? And I don't think anybody really knows the answer to that at this point. Is a renewable portfolio standard required to meet the enforceability requirements? Will we have to have a state law requiring that for us to take credit for it? And how is distributed solar quantified in credit? Distributed solar meaning if people put solar panels on their home, which reduces their electricity usage, how do you capture that and take credit for it? So those are some of the questions we're wrestling with, and we're asking a lot of these questions to EPA, and many of them are, well, we don't know, you should comment on that. So we are. On energy efficiency, certainly GFA's been sort of the lead agency on that historically in Georgia. And so we're relying on their expertise to sort of take the lead on looking at that piece. What is the best approach for Georgia? And again, this whole issue of how you assure that the emissions are reductions and the savings are measurable, verifiable, enforceable. That is, while the utilities and the people who have worked in this area have systems they use to do this historically, in terms of measurement and verifiable, they usually aren't in the mode of enforceability. That's not really a concern if you're just doing this as a utility program. But it is a requirement, of course, for the Clean Air Act. So, again, it's that one gets particularly messy in trying to implement something like that. Comments on the proposed rule due December 1, and we're working on them. We have drafted things, and it'll be fairly extensive comments, I'm sure. So that's kind of what I had for today. Any questions?
Thank you. Would you take questions if there are any?
Sure.
Okay. If you have a question, if you would, I think the same way as in the other rooms, if you'll press your request to speak button. I don't see any right now. I've got a couple. And I would ask the members of the committee, with this speaker or any, if you do have questions, if we just make the questions as specific and direct as possible, because I do want to have an opportunity, since this is for information, I want to make sure we have an opportunity to hear from as many people that are here who wish to speak today as possible. And, it is informative, not really here to debate or anything like that, just trying to get information. And while I'm asking these, if you have a question, just press the button. I'll try to figure this thing out. I haven't used this one for a few years up here. I wanted to ask, you had mentioned that the state would, at some point submit a plan. Who in the state, what agency, is it the executive branch, the government, who actually submits the plan, the state's plan?
EPD would submit the state plan.
Okay, and under what authority do you do that?
It's the Clean Air Act. I mean, we have authority to administer the Clean Air Act requirements.
The Clean Air Act?
The EPA sets the federal rules and standards, and EPD applies those. But in Georgia.
And here again, I'm not trying to be here just for information, but for the EPD, for the EPD, which is a state agency, to do anything, it has to have authority under state statutes to do that. That's where I'm getting at. The EPA.
Well, I think. I think it maybe depends on the rule. I think there's certain things probably we don't have authority for. For example, to say you have to build X amount of renewable energy, because that's not kind of an emission thing.
Right. I mean, I'm just trying to figure it out, really.
But we can do a plan a different way that sets an emission limit that maybe has that effect. Or as you've seen, I mean, a lot of the reductions that have happened in Georgia, EPD didn't write a rule and say, Georgia Power, you need to convert these plants to natural gas, right. But some of our rules had that effect, or at least were a factor in some of that.
And I mean, really, that's what I'm trying to get a handle on. What the EPA has got this proposed rule that, if it goes into effect, then the state is required to submit a plan. Mm-hmm. And I'm just trying to figure out, who does that. And you had mentioned before, or I don't know, the previous speaker, I think had mentioned that the EPD is working with GFA and the Georgia Public Service Commission, mm-hmm. which is good. But I'm just trying to get a handle on that too for us about, I mean, that's great that you're working together, but who is the captain of this team? Like who does actually then have to?
At least, it's fallen to us as the lead agency on it.
Okay.
Just actually have to respond.
All right. And I'd have a question here about related to natural gas. When you look at these numbers, the percentage of natural gas under the proposed plan would go up for Georgia considerably. Mm-hmm. And for the regulated company, for Georgia Power, there is a way to there's a way for them to be reimbursed or recover costs for the infrastructure that they'd have to put in place, the pipelines and the conversions and things of that nature. There is a method for them to recover those costs from the ratepayers. But for the membership corporations and for MEAGs, I don't know that there is nothing under the Georgia Public Service Commission. There's no way for them to recover that cost. There is no set way for them to recover that cost, and they would have to recover it from their members or from their customers. That is true, is it not? That there is a different way for Georgia Power, a regulated company, to recover costs for that conversion, which I would imagine there'd be a considerable amount of cost for that conversion to natural gas. There's a way for them to recover costs, but there is no way other than just raising rates for the customers and members of the MEAGs and the membership corporations. I mean, I'm asking a question. I don't know.
That's my understanding. Yes.
Okay. Let's see. I think that pretty much is it. What you said is that EPD has identified problems with the proposed rule, and that you all have made your concerns known to EPA, I think, and that I don't know whether you said that you'd asked for. I know other people have asked for, but I think you may have said that y'all had asked for changes in dates or extensions. I don't know if EPD actually did that or not, but basically that's the gist of it, that there are problems and issues that the dates need to be at least moved out. Did you say that?
Well, we haven't specifically asked for a different date other than the comment extension, but that's an option. We haven't fully evaluated it.
Well, I mean, I really appreciate it, it's purely trying to understand this thing better. And you had mentioned the energy efficiency that GFA would be, they'd be kind of looking at that, and GFA has worked with energy efficiency before, and is working with it. But it would seem like I would have to agree. I think you basically expressed the sentiment that that's going to be something that's very hard to identify, very hard to quantify. And but that is energy efficiency. I give credit to the EPA for having that in the proposal, because that is one of the most important steps in this whole process. If you have less usage, then you have less carbon going in the air.
Yes,
but it seemed like it'd be a very difficult one to address. Okay, we do have a couple of questions now. And I don't know what number anybody's at. I'm going to go to number 1 first. And I think this will turn you on down there. Maybe not. Are you on? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. A couple of quick questions. Have you been given any rationale as to why Georgia is held to a higher standard than some of its bordering states? I know that was part of that was part of Mary's presentation, that she made comments about that. And have you been given any reasoning for why we're held at such a higher standard?
The reasoning is pretty simplistic, but it is the reason that is that 2012, when the EPA was writing the rule, 2012 was just the most recent full year of data they had. So they picked 2012 as a baseline year just because that was the most recent. And then they applied these formulas, and the numbers just came out different for different states. If you had a different mix of gas and coal, if you didn't have any gas like Kentucky, then they didn't have to ramp up their gas because they didn't have any. So that kind of thing.
So are you, pardon my ignorance, am I hearing you say that because we had been doing better than other states, we are now having to increase how much better we are doing? Am I hearing that right?
It turns out that way, it seems.
Okay. And one other kind of set of questions here. Did I see correctly that it was a requirement to have a 70% mix of natural gas by, is it year 2030 or? No,
it's not a 70% mix. Maybe
Okay.
I didn't explain that properly, but it is greater increase the utilization of the existing natural gas. So it's the existing natural gas units are running about, in 2012 anyway, on average about 50% of their capacity. So the idea is you bring them up to 70%.
Okay. And last question. We have certainly seen a remarkable decline in the price of natural gas over the last 10 years. I mean, I remember it was not all that long ago.
Yes, sir.
So as a personal as a private consumer, I was paying a much higher therm rate than I am today. Is there any consideration in the EPA's plan for price? If we have a spike in natural gas prices, does that have any effect on this? Is there any consideration taken in for that?
Well, that is certainly an example of something that might change the energy markets dramatically if there was some spike in that cost. And so that's one of the things I was talking about. They have to have some way to be able to amend these plans in the event of something like that. Right now, it's not in the proposal, but that's certainly something I think a lot of people are going to be asking for.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Representative Teasley. Representative Holmes, you have a question? Oh, you don't. Okay. Push your button if you would. There should be a button associated. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you. I've got a question along the chairman trying to figure out how we're going to meet these mandates and requirements, and you're trying to do these by these dates, but this legislative, do you anticipate this legislative body having to pass laws on the people of Georgia, new laws that would make us in compliance to these mandates? Or is it going to be all regulation?
Well, I think there's possibilities either way, and part of the issue that we have with the rule is that it is kind of soft. There's so many questions that haven't been answered yet. So, I mean, I think ideally we would just try to do it through regulation, but if somehow it was decided a different approach might work, then it might require some legislative action, yes.
Well, I guess my worry is that you agree, EPD, or agreeing to these mandates will tie our hands or force us legislatively down the road to have to pass some laws that would get us in compliance. I mean,
No, I don't.
You don't foresee that?
No, that's not going to happen, no, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, Representative Dickey. Representative Fraser, I know you got a question. Let me see if I can turn your mic on. Go ahead and see it.
Mr. Chairman? Yes, it's on. Thank you. I was just listening at your presentation as you talked about measuring the carbon emissions. And am I to understand that the EPD does not have a reliable measuring system? And the reason I'm asking that is I live about an hour from Plant Vogel, 1, 2, 3, and 4 that they're building right now. Mm-hmm. And I'm very concerned about what's out in the air. And you gave us some numbers, 834. Right. Is that a projection for 2020 or
no, that's
upon completion?
That's the goal that EPA has calculated that we would have to be at it in 2030.
So the lower number means good, and the higher numbers, I assume, for other states, 1,100 and above, is more.
That's more.
And then you said later that there was another estimated projection rate in the 900s.
Right.
So we starting off good, and we're going to get.
No, it's a matter of what is the correct number for us to hit in 2030.
So I'm asking, is that like a safe level, a safe zone, or?
No, ma'am.
Since I'm downwind
this
from the
whole
plant?
thing is about greenhouse gases, which contribute to global warming. So it's not a local air quality issue at all.
Okay, that's what I was concerned about.
Right.
And Mr. Chairman, I do have one other question. Maybe he can ask, but it might have been for Ms. Walker, as it relates to Georgia Power and the renewable energy. I understand we have a 10% projection rate, and I'm just particularly concerned, would like to know about the solar part of it. The solar energy projection is 10%. I'm looking at your slide, but I don't see a projection date. In 2020, we've been talking about solar for the last 3 years here in the legislature, and I just want to know the projections for Georgia Power in the coming year or two.
Well, I mean, all I know is what's been announced, and I think it's going to be like 900 megawatts of solar by 2016, end of 2016. Beyond that, I think Georgia Power would have to answer that question.
Thank you, Representative Frazier. That's all the questions I see, except that we have 3 members that aren't seated up here: Representative Coach Williams, Representative Harbin, Representative Drenner, and the screen is going off for your request to speak. I don't know; it may come back on when you hit it. I don't know, but if you ask and I don't recognize you, just kind of wave, and so I can know that you've asked a question. And with that, thank you very much. It's been very informative, and we appreciate. I would ask one more thing, and that is, again, to Representative Dickey's question and to what I'd asked before. I'm not trying to put you on the spot at all. In fact, I'm going to let you off the spot. But if you could, get with me in the coming weeks and so we can kind of talk. I'm still not clear about how the plan is filed and who does it and what has to be done. Just so that's kind of what we as members of this committee really need to know. Because as far as legislation being passed, the only thing, I don't know what may have to happen, but it could be that we would need to pass legislation, it seems to me, as far as giving authority, moving authority, something like that, for the filing of the plan. It's a question mark for me, but I need to understand it better. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. All right, thank you. We have a gentleman here from Georgia Tech, is my understanding. Leo, is that correct? Yes. And this must be the gentleman right here. If you would introduce yourself and tell us what you do, it's my understanding, with Georgia Tech, and tell us how your position and what you want to present to us relates to this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm Dr. Sam Shelton. I've been at Georgia Tech now for over 40 years. The entire time I worked in the energy sector, which makes me a little bit of an oddball in the academic community. I'm a generalist in nature and have covered all of the energy issues over the last 40 years. Let me just say that this is one of the largest events that is impacting and creating a lot of discussion within the energy community. But I founded the Strategic Energy Institute at Georgia Tech back in 2004, and since stepped down from that and am a fellow now working with them. But we're the gateway to any energy issues that you'd like to Georgia Tech to answer questions about. And by the way, Mr. Chairman, the last question that you asked about the legislative needs on this issue, I'm not an attorney and I don't study those in detail, but I think you're right in that this is an open question if I read a lot of the legal opinions from various people in the legal community. A lot of them are asking that same question that you just asked. So you're not the only one that's has some questions about this. So I don't want to duplicate anything that EPD has done a good job of discussing and bringing forward. But let me just comment on a couple things here to begin with. And number one, the 30% reduction on a national basis references the 2005 levels. Now, I'm not sure their motivation for going back to 2005, but if you look at the CO2 emissions from power plants across the country, they peaked in 2005, and the total CO2 emissions are about 15% below what the total CO2 emissions were in 2005 by 2012. If you compare 2012 and 2005, they are down about 15% in total emissions, not this emission rate number that you've seen, and that is CO2 emissions per unit of energy produced. But let me just say that number is sort of like the mileage number that when you go to the dealer and buy a car, it'll say have a mileage rating on it by the EPA, but the warning that this is not what you might actually get on the road. So it's something they use for a measuring stick, but there's many ways to calculate this number, and they have told you how you need to calculate it in order to meet this 834 pounds per megawatt hour. So one thing that has not been mentioned is what's the cost of this ruling? Well, according to the U.S. EPA, they are required when they issue a ruling like this to give run a cost analysis, an economic analysis. And according to their numbers, it'll cost about $7 billion annually starting in 2020 as the industry starts trying to meet this new standard. And the benefits, according to their numbers, range from $23 billion to $59 billion per year. Most of those are health benefits and climate benefits. Obviously, those numbers are going to be debated quite a bit, but that's where they're coming from. And they are, by law, required to do two things when they issue this kind of ruling. Number one is to run an economic analysis to determine the economic impact, and number two, show that the mandate can be met with existing technology, that no new technology is required to be developed in order to meet this standard. And that says a lot as to why they took the approach that they did. The first thing I saw when, as most of you did that have looked at it, when I looked at the ruling is how in the world did they come up with these different numbers for every state? And why did each state is saying, why did they penalize us? If I look at it from their viewpoint, I think what they're trying to do is spread the pain around. If they had set a level of emissions per unit of electricity produced the same for every state, there are a lot of states, for instance, California would have to do nothing. States like Kentucky would literally probably bankrupt the state in order to try to meet that number. So I think one of the motivations was in order to spread the pain around and to make each state have to spend some money to do better than they would do without the regulation being issued. So that I think that's pretty obvious that they wanted to hit each state and try to get them to do better, regardless of what they had done in the past. Now, you can argue with that, but I think that was what they finally came to as a basis for coming up with all these numbers. And has been pointed out a couple times, these measures that they use to calculate the emissions level that they wanted you to get to are straw men. They are absolutely straw men, and you can knock them off the table and do your own plan. The only thing they use those straw man measures that you've seen up here, such as getting 6% more efficiency out of the coal plants, running your natural gas plants and the coal plant more and the coal plants less, and completing the nuclear power plant, and putting in renewable energy and demand side management for higher efficiency. All those were straw men that are existing technology, and what they used to calculate the measure, the level that they wanted each state to get to. And there again, by law, they had to show that you could get there with some existing technology, and those are the ones they picked, and they felt like they were probably the most cost-effective if you looked at them across the country. As has been discussed already, some of those measures make sense for some states, and some of those measures don't make sense for other states, I think, when you get down into the rock-hard numbers. What I've done is I've split up the measures that those four, or I call them five, because I split them out into five measures rather than four, in order to understand it better. But what the goal is reduce our emissions by about 45%, 46%, somewhere in there. 16% of that, according to their calculations, can be met by completing Vogtle. And by the way, there's a lot of discussion about they didn't give us credit for Vogtle, and EPA says, yes, we're giving you credit for Vogtle. But the problem is they gave us credit, but then they're taking it away, or actually they took it away first, and now they're giving it back. Because they're saying, if you complete Vogtle, then we're going to give you credit for that. But they raised the bar so that they assumed that Georgia would complete that Vogtle plant. So that explains some of the argument. You hear people say, well, they are giving us credit, and other people say, no, they're not giving us credit, because they kind of played a game with us there and giving it to us and then taking it back away. But if you complete that, if we complete that, that'll give us 16% of the 45% that we have to attain. So that's about a third of it. So about a third of the goal can be obtained by completing the Vogtle plan, as hopefully we planned. If by running the natural gas plants more and coal plants less, they calculate that we can reduce our emissions by 14%. So those two things, without any new construction of anything that we didn't plan for before the rule was announced, would get about 30% of the 45, 46%. Now the other measures that you've seen talked about, one is install some renewable energy, and they calculate that'll get 7%, and then the improved efficiency about 6%. Efficiency about 6%, and the demand management side. So, and then the coal plant efficiency is about 5%, and that's 6%. I would certainly agree that number might make sense across the country, but it's more applicable to some states than it is to others about whether you can improve your coal power plant's efficiency by as much as 6%. But there again, these measures are strictly straw men that they use to calculate the standard, the goal that they want you to get to. And so you can knock them off the table and use any method and any means that you want to in order to accomplish that goal. That is the way they have set those up. Those are not mandated measures that we have to take in order to meet the goal. The schedule, you've seen the schedule. I think everybody agrees that looks at this, I certainly do, that it's a very tight schedule. I doubt that EPA will meet their own schedule for issuing the standard in June, the final rulemaking by June of 2015. We'll have to wait to see if they do, but they're going to have a lot to digest in order to issue that, to look at all of the comments, and some serious comments that were based on a lot of good calculations, and in order to take it into account, to make modifications to the rule in order to accommodate those comments or respond to them at least. So I expect the schedule to be pushed back myself, and I've been around a long time and have been through this rodeo before. Let me just remind, one thing I think we have to realize is that the Supreme Court did rule that U.S. EPA has the authority to regulate CO2 emissions. I doubt seriously that they're going to change their ruling on that. And they just issued that ruling in the last year or so. So they do have the authority, according to the Supreme Court, to regulate CO2 emissions from electric power plants. Now, how they do it, obviously, is another question. And they have told us how they propose to regulate them. And now it's up to all of us in order to respond to that. And just in closing, let me just say that Georgia Tech is here in order to try to help this process. We try to be an honest broker, and we try to deal with the facts and look at it from that honest broker viewpoint. And if there's any way that we can help this process, Georgia, get through this process, we're glad to do it. We are, of course, a state university, and we want to make any contribution that we can in order to help this process along. So with that, I'll close my comments and, again, offer our help. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I don't see any question. I did want to ask you, while you were speaking, I was thinking about some of the comments that Senator Manchin from West Virginia said about coal, and the fact that this EPD proposed rule doesn't really take in consideration that with technological advances with coal, it would be possible, if the emphasis were placed on that, it would be possible for the use of coal to meet standards, either similar or to these standards that have been proposed. And I'm just wondering, this proposed rule speaks to specific types of energy, renewables, gas, nuclear, coal. Wouldn't it have been a more intellectually honest way to address that if they had just said by 2030 or some specific date that these are the limits of carbon emissions that would be allowed, regardless of whether you burned hickory wood or however what you did to produce your energy, instead of saying specifically you have to use these percentages of these renewables, gas, so on and so forth?
The rule does not say this is what you have to do. They are not saying you have to use more gas and less coal.
Okay.
That is merely something that they proposed as one thing that you could do. And they said, if you do this, then these are the reductions that you can get. And they use that methodology and that technology and those measures to establish what the level of emissions that Georgia has to meet. But we can accomplish that goal and meet that goal and not use a single one of their measures.
Okay, well, that's
we
good
can meet
information.
it any way we want to.
So those are kind of suggestions?
I call them straw men.
What?
A straw man.
Straw man.
They put them on the table, but it's not a permanent fixture. You can knock it off the table and do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. We do not have to follow any of those measures. They only use those measures, like more gas, in order to calculate what theoretically in their minds could be accomplished if we did that. Now they say, and they used it to say this therefore is the level that you need to get to because we think you can get there using these measures, but we don't care how you get there. They absolutely are not mandating any particular measure that we take. They're saying if you reduce your emissions by this amount, you meet the regulation and we're through with you.
Okay, that's good information. I did not understand that.
Yeah, that's a very important point.
Well, let me ask you this: as a Georgia Tech professor and somebody who has a background in energy, what do you think? Or if you can't comment on this, it's fine. But I'm just wondering, is the possibility there for the use of coal, for technological advances to be made in the burning of coal to reduce the amount of carbon that it emits, or is the only possibility the capture of the carbon? What are the possibilities for the use of coal? We have these vast reserves of coal in this country, throughout the country, really, and we have people who depend on the mining of it to feed their families, clothe their families. And it would appear to me that maybe this is going to really have a very negative impact on those families, those people, those communities, and those states. Is there anything that can be done to other than the capture of carbon to further the use of coal?
A big yes on that, and the Southern Company in Mississippi, of course, in Mississippi through Mississippi Power, is building the only commercial-sized coal-fired power plant that is going to use CO2 separation. They're separating the CO2. They got a pipeline that are sending it down to oil wells where these wells are buying CO2 from the market and injecting it into the oil wells in order to push up more oil. So they're actually going to sell the CO2 and transport it. That is a commercial-sized plant. It's under construction, just like our Vogel plant is under construction. The cost effectiveness we'll know, once it gets completed, and obviously the number 2 plant using that technology is going to be a lot cheaper than the number 1 plant. But there are technologies out there. There's no question about it. It's not a matter of having the technology. It's a matter of what it costs to implement that technology so that we can use coal and yet not have our CO2 emissions that's normally associated with it.
Thank you. Representative Holmes has a question.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for a very informative presentation.
Thank you.
And I'm just curious now, you've indicated that we can meet a large portion of our goal by using natural gas, but do you think that as soon as we shut down our coal and switch to natural gas, they're going to reduce carbon emissions from natural gas?
Yes, but the carbon emissions from natural gas are about half of what they are from coal. So if you produce the same amount of electricity from a coal plant as from a natural gas combined cycle plant, the natural gas plant will emit half as much CO2 as the coal plant. It's the nature of the fuel and the technology. So that's the reason running the natural gas plants more and running the coal plants less will reduce carbon emissions, because if you generate the same electricity with natural gas, the emissions from that plant will be less, the carbon emissions. And about half. Almost, it's very, very close to 50%. Now, one thing I'd like to comment about doing that is that means that you have to, what we call, load follow with the coal plants. You have to turn the plants up and down to follow the load that customers have between 5 o'clock in the afternoon when they have the air conditioner on and 3 o'clock in the morning when they're not using hardly any. They would need to run the gas plants, what we call base load, and modulate the coal plants. That can have some issues. A coal plant trying to stop and start or slow down and speed up a coal plant is kind of like trying to stop and start up a loaded semi-truck versus a gas plant, which is more like a Corvette. It can come up to speed very quickly and stop very quickly. But the coal plant, you have to be careful about how fast you want to shut it down or crank it up. So there are issues there. There are technical issues.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you coming. Appreciate the presentation.
Thank you, Mr.
I don't see any further questions. I think that actually concludes the presentations, but definitely want to take comments from the public. Who? Is Dr. Young here, Dr. Walter Young? I had a conversation with him the other day. I want to make sure he gets an opportunity to speak. Kevin Cochran, are you here? Or somebody in his place, I believe. Atlanta Fire Department, somebody here from Atlanta Fire Department? Beg your pardon? Okay, have him come on up. I think it was a scheduling issue for this person. He has on a pretty fancy uniform. He must be pretty high in that department. Yeah, come on up. Yes, sir. If you would introduce yourself, and we know you're with the Atlanta Fire Department, and tell us what your position is, and you know what relation to this issue that you're going to speak of.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, good morning. I'm Kelvin Cochran, the Fire Chief of the Atlanta Fire and Rescue Department, and I bring you greetings on behalf of Mayor Kasim Reed and on behalf of the brave and heroic women and men of the Atlanta Fire and Rescue Department. And it is my pleasure this morning to speak briefly regarding the Clean Power Plan and its impact on climate change and emergency preparedness and first responders all over the United States of America. Our nation's first responders are on the front lines of climate change, encountering increasingly dangerous hazards from rising temperatures, more frequent, severe, and extreme weather events that compromise the well-being of our residents, businesses, and the critical infrastructure systems of our nation states and cities. The size, scope, and occurrences of natural disasters have been trending upward since the early 1970s. Climate change is responsible for many of the increases of natural disasters, as stated by many with scientific and research backgrounds. It increases the risk to first responders as a result of that. According to the Department of Homeland Security, and I quote, more intense storms, frequent heavy precipitation, heat waves, drought, extreme flooding, and higher sea levels could significantly change the types and magnitudes of hazards impacting communities and the emergency management professionals serving at the federal, state, and local levels. As coastal regions become increasingly populated and developed, more frequent and severe storms will increase the requirements for emergency services response and recovery capability. Continuity of operations, delivery of services, and emergency response might be challenged and made increasingly complex by damages to or disruptions of interconnected energy and infrastructure networks, end quotes. One of the little-known facts about the impact of increasingly devastating natural disasters is that 40% of businesses that are devastated by natural disasters never reopen, adversely impacting the economy of families and local communities. In the emergency services industry, we have begun to repeat this phrase year after year. The worst case scenario relative to natural disasters keeps getting worse. In 2012, wildland fires burned almost 10 million acres of land across the United States, and that number is trending this year to be exceeded, displacing families, destroying forests, and making it nearly impossible to breathe, particularly for those with asthma and other respiratory challenges. And there are many fire departments in the nation that respond to emergency medical services calls dealing with these respiratory emergencies. And in the fiscal years of 2011 and 12 in our country, the United States spent more than $60 billion cleaning up from climate-related disasters that are on the rise. According again to the Department of Homeland Security, more frequent and severe storms will increase the requirements of emergency services response and recovery capacity, especially in coastal areas and those damaged by those that damage infrastructure, whereas city and county resources combined to respond to disasters will not be adequate, requiring statewide responses across states, and even we face the potential of national deployment of fire resources to mitigate natural disasters, as we experienced in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina. Climate change is already being observed by Americans from the Pacific to the Atlantic, as evidenced by recent disasters around the world, like Hurricane Katrina and Rita in 2005, the Pacific tsunami of 2006, the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, Japan's tsunami, earthquake, and nuclear release all in one incident in 2011, and the devastating Hurricane Sandy in 2012. In the state of Georgia, we have had our share of impacts of climate change and natural disasters with the 2008 historical tornado in downtown Atlanta. Tornadoes never hit downtowns. And this year in Boston, the first ever tornado in the city of Boston, and it was in their downtown area. Floods in our state in 2009, historical floods, I might add. 2011, in 1 year, we were impacted by a major winter storm, southeast tornadoes of the same magnitude of devastating hurricanes in Alabama and in Georgia. And in 2011, we had an earthquake on the East Coast. And this year, all of us are still reeling from the 2014 winter storms, Leon and Pax, that are still fresh on our minds. Cleaning up after climate-driven disasters last year in our nation was $100 billion, one of the largest non-defense discretionary budget items for 2012. The majority of costs associated with cleaning up disasters in Georgia are borne by its own residents, because many of those disasters do not reach a federal level of declaration whereby we gain federal financial aid. States and their cities, therefore, are the natural leverage point for addressing climate change. We understand how specific risk and the adaptation and mitigation efforts underway through public and private partnerships and academic institutions collaborating to reduce our vulnerability in our state to climate-related disruptions and impacts threaten the health and safety of residents and businesses in Georgia. Supporting the EPA rule is an important mitigation strategy for Georgia. President Obama's climate plan, which is full of responsible solutions to seek further mitigation of pollution, starting with the call for the EPA to limit carbon emissions from power plants, is essential. While limits for arsenic, mercury, and lead have been established, there are no controls governing the release of carbon pollution from power plants. It's time to set a limit on pollution that affects public health, and that's why it's important for Georgia to rise to the challenge. According to the 2014 National Climate Change Assessment, and I quote, "Climate change and its impacts threaten the well-being of urban residents all over the United States. Essential infrastructure systems such as water, energy supply, and transportation will increasingly be compromised by interrelated climate change impacts. The nation's economy, security, and culture all depend on the resilience of urban infrastructure systems," end quote. In conclusion, action must be taken now to reduce the impact of climate change that subsequently increases the size, scope, and frequency of natural disasters. According to the International Energy Agency, if an action to reduce CO2 emissions is not taken before 2017, all the allowable CO2 emissions would be locked in by energy infrastructure existing at that time. Rapid deployment of energy-efficient technologies would postpone this complete lock-in until 2022, buying time to secure a much-needed global agreement to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Finally, a quote from Professor David McKay of the United Kingdom, advisor to the Department of Energy and Climate, states, "We need to take action now. Waiting a decade or two before taking climate change action will certainly lead to greater harm. He further states, the far-reaching consequences of this warming are becoming understood, although some uncertainties remain. However, the most significant uncertainty is how much carbon humanity will continue to put up with, to put in the atmosphere until harm has been reduced. Those are my remarks, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. But as Fire Chief of the City of Atlanta, I would be remiss in my duty with this being Fire Prevention Week if I did not conclude my remarks by saying all of you should test your smoke alarms this month. And if you don't have a working smoke alarm, contact your local fire department. Most of us will install them for free. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I don't see any questions, but we appreciate you taking time out to come. We appreciate all your work in protecting us and all that you do. It's an honor to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Dr. Young is not here yet, is he? Dr. Young. Clay Robbins, I know you're here. If you would come up, sir. Oglethorpe Power. We know who you are, but if you would, when you come to the mic, if you'd introduce yourself, tell us who you're with and what your position is there.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Clay Robbins. I'm the Senior Vice President of Governmental Affairs for Oglethorpe Power Corporation. Today I'd like to talk to you about the potential impacts of the Clean Carbon Plan, or Section 111D of the Federal Clean Air Act, on the 4.5 million Georgians that are served by electric cooperatives and, more broadly, the state of Georgia. Oglethorpe Power is the electric generation cooperative owned by 38 of Georgia's EMCs. Corporation has almost $9 billion of generation assets and another $4.5 billion under construction through our 30% share of the 2 new units at Plant Vogel. These assets are made up of a balanced portfolio that includes coal, nuclear, natural gas, and hydro, and are complemented by the new renewable portfolio through our sister company, Green Power EMC, and the energy efficiency programs of our member EMCs. We've heard an awful lot of talk this morning about 111D, and I just want to give you a little bit of perspective about what 111D actually is and what compliance will mean for the state and the respective power producers. And you get the impression that 111D is really a big thing. Here is 111D. It's written on a half a page of paper. It's 291 words. However, EPA's vision for how utilities and the states would have to implement 111D would cover more than 3 reams of paper, over 1,600 pages. And that doesn't even include the state plans that will have to be developed by all 50 states and a plan that will have to be developed by every single utility to be able to comply. We think that this will change forever the way that power is produced, delivered, and what it will cost the consumers at the end of the line. Further, we don't believe that Section 111D of the Clean Air Act was ever intended to regulate carbon. I want to loosely borrow from an analogy of the Affordable Care Act, which is actually shorter than the Clean Power Plan, and that is if you like your coal plant, you can keep it, you just can't run it. On top of that, if you spend $14 billion on a zero-emission resource, you in turn get 0 credit for it under this plan. So I just want to make a few general points on our concern that we have and the potential impacts on Oglethorpe Power and the EMC customers across the state. And you've heard a number of these points before, particularly in EPD's presentation. The first one is we don't believe the Clean Power Plan as proposed fairly spreads the burden of reducing CO2 emissions across the states. While Georgia has already reduced its tons of CO2 emissions by about 30% between 2005 and 2012 The state is required to reduce its emissions by another 44% between 2012 and 2030. And this is the 6th largest reduction of any of the states. Other states, which have been much less proactive than Georgia in the past, are being required to do much less than Georgia in the future. The second point I wanted to make is under construction, zero-emission nuclear should not be included in the calculation of the state's goals. EPA's inclusion of Vogtle 3 and 4 and setting Georgia's performance standard as if it has already been completed and in service is inequitable and misguided in our view. Despite the billions of dollars invested by the partners in the expansion of Plant Vogtle, zero credit is being given to meet the compliance requirements under the proposed regulation. We believe this is an egregious error and must not stand in the final rule. I would like to give a shout out to EPD for the early filing that they made on this point to EPA on under construction nuclear. It was very comprehensive, very persuasive, and we hope it carries the day with EPA, and we're appreciative of them for doing that. Another point, Georgia's consumers deserve to fully realize the benefits of their coal plant investments. Oglethorpe has invested over $1 billion in pollution control equipment, which is more than our original investment in the plants in order to stay compliant with just existing laws and regulations. And those investments have resulted in dramatic air quality improvements. They're expected to be able to generate reliable and affordable energy well into the 21st century. Our preliminary analysis shows that these plants can continue to generate electricity in an economically beneficial manner, but compliance with this plan would cause generation to be significantly curtailed, requiring additional costs to replace the power, most likely at higher prices. Another significant concern relates to how heavily the cost of compliance depends on the future cost of natural gas, which has historically been extremely volatile. Additionally, we have serious concerns about the pipelines and other infrastructure needed to transport and supply this increased amount of natural gas, and the risk on supply imposed by potential natural disasters. Also, the ability to generate using natural gas during the polar vortex earlier this year was severely hampered by the recent record cold. In part, nuclear and coal generation saved the state from further harm. Finally, as to gas, we firmly believe that once EPA finishes with coal, that natural gas, which produces about half the emissions of coal, will be the next target in the administration's quest for a carbon-constrained world. Renewables and energy efficiency are other options proposed by EPA to achieve compliance with their proposed targets. Georgia's EMCs utilize both of these today on an economic basis and want to continue to do so when it is economical for the customer. However, we are not in favor of any energy efficiency or renewable energy mandates imposed by the federal government or the states. Finally, we're concerned about the potential impact that EPA's Clean Power Plan will have on the cost of electricity for our member systems and their customers. And despite some claims to the contrary by EPA itself and some supporters of the Clean Power Plan, make no mistake, power costs will increase if this plan is implemented in its current form. This is of great concern to those 4.5 million Georgians served by electric cooperatives, many of whom are the least able to afford any increase in their cost of electricity and the other costs of living linked to power prices. That concludes my remarks, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you. You do have a question, it looks like. I don't know which one of y'all down there to number one mic, but somebody down there has a question.
That was pretty. Mr. Rock, thank you for your comments. You kind of addressed it toward the end on the cost to the user. And I guess my question is, the overall goal for the state would be the same once it's determined, but your cost to individual utilities could definitely be different. Is that a true statement?
Yes, we all three of the utilities, we've talked about how to actually get to a cost number, and we have people back at all of our offices running models extensively, looking at different cost scenarios, using different assumptions. And as I said, this plan is extremely complex. It's this much paper, And so we are trying to figure out what it means to each utility. And because of the differences in our makeup of our assets, there can be differences.
So, as even in my district, I know you have actual neighborhoods that are served by different entities. I know now, I'm sure with competition, you try to keep things sort of the same, but it's possible that you could have neighborhoods next to each other that pay extremely different rates.
I don't know about extremely, but certainly
different.
Could be possible that they would pay different rates.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you, I don't think there are any other questions from the members. Having something of a military background, I know that we always rate things, in my background being Signal Corps, telecommunications, we would rate everything by security types of communication. For power, for electric generation, if you had three power plants sitting, close together, three cities exactly the same size, equidistant apart. One of them was powered by solar, one was powered by natural gas, one was powered by coal. Which one of those would be the most secure?
I think you're kind of way out of my league right now. It's secure in terms
secure in the fact that you would have, if there was some kind of a something happened, a natural disaster, something happened that a pipeline was destroyed,
I see where you're
no
going.
Sunshine.
I see
but
where
wouldn't
you're
you
going
have you would have a stockpile of coal, I think. Is that not correct?
Yeah, I see where you're going now. If it's a natural disaster like hurricane, tornado, heavy rain, whatever, it's not likely the sun's going to be shining. So solar would be probably the least reliable, and depending on the ability to get the natural gas to the source, then the natural gas would have probably a higher risk. As you point out, at the coal plants, the coal pile's sitting there and ready to be burned.
Thank you. I just violated my own rule. I didn't want any leading questions asked today, but I couldn't resist it. Thank you. Thank you.
We have two engineers following me. You can ask them all the detailed technical questions.
Thank you. Appreciate you coming today.
Thank you.
Is John Wood here? Yes, sir. If you would come up. If you would introduce yourself, tell us who you're with, and what your relationship to this issue is.
Well, thank you. My name is John Wood. I'm here as a representative of the Coal Blue Project. And before I begin, I've actually got some materials if we can share this with the committee.
Yes, sir. If you would leave those right there. We're not going to give out any material right now, but yes, sir. Appreciate you bringing it.
Much of what I will speak to is contained in those slides. Briefly, the Coal Blue Project is a coalition, a nationwide initiative led by Democrats to reach out to other Democrats to build support for sustainable energy policies that include sustainable coal. Our starting point is recognizing the enduring role that coal will play in meeting both U.S. and global energy demand for decades to come. As a result, given our interest in addressing the carbon challenge, we see no alternative but to develop the technologies that will allow us and allow the world to manage the carbon in coal, not simply wish it away. And let me also be clear, while we are Democrats reaching out to Democrats, our mission, our goal is much broader than that. Our goal is to create broad bipartisan support, but to have Democrats serve as the messengers of this message in reaching out broadly to all, both parties, to all energy stakeholders, environmental stakeholders, in trying to accomplish this. With regard to the pending EPA regulations, we take perhaps a little bit of a different tack. We don't disagree with the concerns that have been raised about the impacts on cost and on reliability, but we actually we believe that these rules actually don't make sense from an environmental point of view. We believe they do not advance the goal of seriously addressing the global carbon challenge. And the reason is simply this. We believe the United States needs to be the leader. We should be the leader in addressing the carbon challenge. But to be a leader, you have to have followers. And the path set out in 111D essentially involves a shift to higher cost energy, which we would argue no other nation is going to follow that path, certainly not the developing world. And that's where the battle on climate will be won or lost. Just a few statistics to share with you. According to the International Energy Agency, coal consumption globally between 2010 and 2035 will increase 56%. Coal is the fastest growing fuel in the world in the 21st century. Now in America, we've experienced a decline in coal use in recent years. So our perspective is perhaps a little bit different. But the fact is, globally, coal use is growing rapidly and will continue to grow rapidly. What's the impact of that on carbon emissions? Again, citing the International Energy Agency, between 2005 and 2035, CO2 emissions globally will go up 62%. Now, the EPA's proposal here in 111D would reduce emissions from the U.S. power sector by 30%. But if we threw that out the window and we really became ambitious, if the United States stopped burning coal tomorrow, we tore down every coal-fired power plant, every coal-fired industrial boiler, that increase in emissions globally would go from 62% to 55%. If the entire Western world, the developed world, all the OECD nations of the world, Europe, America, Canada, Japan, Australia, etc., if all the OECD nations stopped burning coal tomorrow, that increase in CO2 emissions would go from 62 to 55 to 48%. A 48% increase in carbon emissions is not a climate solution. The point being, we have to lead in a way that other nations, the nations responsible for that 48% increase in CO2, will follow. Following a path that says let's raise the cost of energy and move to lower carbon fuels that are more expensive is not a path that China, India, or even many developed nations. Germany is now reversing course. They are building new coal plants because the impact of what their policies in recent years have had upon their manufacturing sector and their economy. So our point is the United States does need to lead, but leadership will come through energy innovation and technology development. And with the growth in coal, there is no alternative but for us to strongly begin to develop what is right now the technology for managing the carbon in coal and natural gas, which is carbon capture and storage. And this is where we believe the rule does not make sense. And I will go back and say it is that combination of higher costs to consumers with little environmental improvement. If this rule is fully implemented and it achieves its 30% reduction in U.S. emissions from the power sector, the impact on global carbon emissions by 2030 is less than 1.5%. If other nations do not follow our lead, we will have made no material impact on the climate issue, yet we will have imposed costs on our economy, on ratepayers, on families, businesses, etc. That's where we see this rule is hard to understand. It even is harder in those cases where you have issues of carbon leakage, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with. This is where, and I don't mean to suggest by raising this that carbon leakage is going to overwhelm all of the reductions we're going to make here in the United States, but there will be instances where due to higher energy costs, economic activity will shift overseas. When that shifts to countries that are more carbon intense than we are, which the developing world, China, for example, is, you actually get the perverse result of a net increase in carbon emissions. We believe it's hard to explain to an American worker who has lost their job. It'd be one thing to say, we need to make some sacrifices for the greater good. But if the impact is actually to make the problem worse, because for that dollar of GDP that now is being produced in China and not in the U.S., and there's more CO2 produced in producing that unit of economic activity, how do we explain to American workers, you've lost your job, and we've actually increased global carbon emissions? Again, we believe we've got to come back to, with a focus on energy innovation and technology development, the development of CCS. And let me just make a comment on 111B, the other part of this rule, not the 111D, which applies to existing plants, but on 111B, which applies to new plants. And the EPA there has said that, one, carbon capture and storage is a commercially viable technology today, despite the fact that there is not a single operating power plant in the world that is capturing carbon. But more importantly, I think that the short answer to why we should be concerned about these rules, if you look at the manufacturers, the developers of CCS technology and the manufacturers, companies like Alstom Power, Babcock and Wilcox, et cetera, the companies that stand to profit from a rule that would aggressively drive carbon capture and storage forward. These companies have all expressed serious concerns, if not opposition to the rule. Their concern is that 111B will not drive CCS technology, but will actually drive companies away from it, drive utilities towards natural gas, and away from continued investment in new coal technologies. Again, counterproductive to the rule's own purpose. So we're here, Coal Blue is here to say there is a better way. We're not here to say no. This is not a question of if we should act, it is how we act. And we believe there is a better way that allows us to minimize the impact on consumers, on families, on seniors, but at the same time be the global leaders in what will be the true solution, which is technology. And I'll just close by noting, look back at any environmental challenge that we've addressed. Two things stand out. One, we typically, if not always, meet those challenges through the developments of new technology. We need to do that here. Secondly, we do not make progress by asking people to lower their standards of living. Okay? Through technology, we can address these challenges and continue to grow, both here in the United States and, very importantly, for the developing world as well. The reason they will not follow our lead in this case is they're not going to sacrifice their opportunity to grow their economies, to have their citizens prosper, in the sake of reducing carbon emissions. Technology allows us to have a win-win situation. That's where the focus needs to be, and these rules, both 111B and 111D combined, work against that goal. Thank you.
Thank you. If you would, I don't see any questions. If you would tell us again, I know you said this at the beginning, Coal Blue, tell us just who makes that organization up? And
sure. The Coal Blue Project is a group of Democrats. Our board of directors is all former Democratic office holders. Just quickly, I can run through with former Congressman Jerry Costello from Illinois, John Tanner from Tennessee, Zach Space from Ohio, Ron Klink from Pennsylvania. We also have Tom Getz, who is the former chairman of the New Hampshire Public Utility Commission. We have Del Labrador, who is the former Assistant Secretary of Interior for Indian Affairs in the Obama administration from Montana. And our most recent addition is Kathy Carpin, who was the director of the Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement during the Clinton administration.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you coming today.
Thank you.
Is there anybody here that wished to speak who has not signed up on this form? I want to make sure that everybody understands that this is not, first of all, here again, I violate my own rule by asking a leading question, but it's really to be informative for us to understand and us to know what this is all about better than we have. And if anybody, is a big advocate for it, I mean, I have no intention, not part of my agenda at all, to keep anybody from speaking. Tracy Hawkins from Georgia Power. Yes, ma'am. I introduced you, but if you'd introduce yourself and tell us who you're with and what your position there is and how you relate to this issue.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm going to be brief today. My name is Tracy Hawkins, and I'm currently a general manager of Georgia Power Environmental Affairs. I have 25 years in the energy industry in both utility planning and power plant operations. At Georgia Power, we are committed to providing clean, safe, reliable, and affordable energy to our 2.4 million customers by maintaining a diversified fuel mix for the production of our electricity. We are in the midst of more than $5 billion environmental construction program and will retire about 3,000 megawatts of coal-fired plants over 5 years in order to comply with current environmental rules. Production equal to the energy demand of 3,000 department stores. We believe the EPA's Clean Power Plan is an overreach of that federal agency's authority and is unworkable as written. It plays a high-stakes game with both the affordability and reliability of our state's electricity supply. EPA sets a CO2 reduction target for Georgia that is far too aggressive based on a flawed interpretation of how our electric system works. Today, I'm going to focus on two of the steps that Ms. Walker referenced earlier in setting our state goals. One, EPA's assumption that the efficiency of coal-fired power plants can be improved by 6%, and two, EPA's assumptions that utilities can drastically increase the use of natural gas-fired power plants to provide Georgia's energy needs. First, let's talk about the efficiency of coal-fired power plants. For 4 years, I was the plant manager of Plant Hammond in Rome, Georgia, a coal-fired power plant that produced over 800 megawatts, enough electricity to supply over 800,000 homes. Plant Hammond employs 200 people and brings far-reaching benefits to Floyd County through well-paying jobs, support of surrounding businesses, community service, and a healthy tax base. I was shocked that EPA's Clean Power Plan assumes that the coal-fired fleet can easily improve efficiency by 6%. As power plant operators, we already strive to operate as efficiently and economically as possible. Every day at Hammond, we work to maximize our efficiency and squeeze as much power out of every piece of coal as we can, similar to getting more miles per gallon of gas from your car. Georgia Power has been setting efficiency goals for our power plants for over 40 years. And as a plant manager, I was held accountable for those goals. We have dedicated performance engineers in our plants that look at improving efficiency from every angle, scrutinizing our efficiency to the tenths of a percent, the equivalent of striving to attain a fraction of a mile out of your mile per gallon in a car. $1 of fuel saved is $1 back in our customers' pockets. And those energy consumers have been the beneficiary of the fact that Georgia operates some of the most efficient power plants in the world. In addition, EPA would have coal plants operate less as a result of this rule. So back to the car analogy, we all know that our cars are most efficient when we drive long distances at highway speeds. This rule threatens to force our power plants to drive in what could be compared stop-and-go traffic in a city traffic manner, which is going to hurt, not improve efficiency. Basically, EPA is penalizing us for being proactive and maintaining our fleet to provide reliable, cost-effective generation to our customers. EPA's assumptions have no technical basis and are completely contrary to what most power plant operators have known and experienced for years. Second, let's talk about the dispatch of our power plant fleet. Dispatch means in this case when a plant is called upon to produce electricity to meet our consumers' demand. EPA assumes that every state should dispatch natural gas-fired plants at a 70% rate. For Georgia, that means a 37% increase in natural gas use compared to 2012 levels, the baseline that was established, and a corresponding decrease in the coal use. Prior to becoming a plant manager, I spent over 10 years in utility system planning. Fuel diversity and flexibility are key to protecting customers from sticker shock when prices spike for a given fuel. Natural gas has a history of price swings, or what we call volatility. We think that natural gas volatility will continue in spite of the supply increases. Imposing a CO2 goal that requires an increase in natural gas use independent of consumer economic risks, plus mandating certain levels of energy efficiency and renewables from the other assumptions in this rule, force us away from economic planning and dispatching of our power plant fleet. This rule advances unwise energy strategies that move us away from our successful planning process established by the Georgia legislature and currently implemented by the Georgia Public Service Commission. In closing, Georgia Power believes EPA's Clean Power Plan is both technically and legally flawed. EPA is taking a heavy-handed approach that does not recognize significant efforts we have made in the state of Georgia to be good stewards of the environment while maintaining a reliable and affordable electricity supply for our consumers. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Yes, we do have a question. Representative Holmes.
Yes, thank you so much. This was very good. I am particularly interested in what this ruling is going to mean to citizens of this state, especially the poor senior, especially senior citizens in my district that are on fixed incomes. And I'm trying to learn a little more about this. Now, I know that Georgia Power has closed coal plants. Okay, do you foresee this ruling necessitating the closing of more coal plants?
Yes, I do,
Well,
as it is written today.
well, now, in my limited knowledge, I should think that because of this, the cost of our electricity is going to rise.
Correct.
You know, this is just really totally unacceptable. I don't understand. I do not understand the EPA ruling, number one. I feel sure it just appears to me they have not taken into consideration what this is going to do to the citizens of the country, not just to the citizens of Georgia. But now this is another thing. Do you still owe money for these power plants that you're closing?
Yes, there will be significant stranded investment involved with this.
Well, see, the stranding, well, see, I go back to my days. I was for 12 years, I was mayor of the city of Monticello. We're a small city. We're very proud to be a MEAG city, and we were very proud to provide efficient, reliable power to our citizens in the city. But I know for a fact what a difficult time some of them, and we had to help, and we had to make arrangements for them to pay sometimes, you know, on a payment plan because they simply couldn't afford it. There's so many people in this state that cannot afford a price increase. They just simply cannot afford it. And it concerns me greatly, as I'm sure it does so many people here today. But I want to thank you for what you do, and thank you for a very good presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the questions I see. Thank you. Frank Crane from MEAG.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am Frank Crane, but our COO of MEAG has joined us today, and I'm going to yield my time to him because you'll understand and appreciate a lot more what he has to say than you would from me. Steve came up through MEAG managing our fleet of generation plants, so he's well schooled in this issue, and welcome Steve to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee members, and thank you, Frank, for that introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to provide our perspective on the Clean Power Plan today, the proposal that will regulate carbon dioxide emissions from coal and natural gas-fueled electric generating plants. Just some background, MEAG Power was solely created for one purpose, to serve our 49 communities, public power communities in Georgia with reliable and affordable wholesale power. We operate without profit and we have no shareholders. So all of our costs incurred for power supply are directly reflected in the electric bills of the retail electricity consumers and your constituents in our 49 communities. They are the ones that will bear the impact of these rules. And so I want to give you a little bit of perspective of what our communities have done and the concerns that we have. The regulatory approach on this proposed rule, as you've heard, we feel like goes well beyond Section 111D. Instead of affecting and focusing on emission goals for coal and gas units, they expand the rule to set requirements to address nuclear units, renewables, energy efficiency. And of course, none of these have any emissions, so how can they be required to be regulated under the Clean Air Act? The proposed rule infringes on state and local authority to regulate the electric utility business, and it also infringes on the utility's ability to plan and regulate and operate the electric system in a manner focused on cost and reliability. We have great concerns in both of those areas. The current supply for our 49 communities consists of over 1,200 megawatts of existing nuclear and hydroelectric capacity. And let me refocus. That's existing nuclear. The result is that for our communities, over 50% of our electricity supplied to them is produced while creating no emissions. We've already done what we need to do. This proposed rule provides little credit for these carbon-free resources and instead would require our communities to invest in unneeded renewable energy resources or unneeded energy efficiency programs. Our communities already have an energy portfolio that meets the proposed goals, so our view is there's nothing further that should be required from our communities. Looking to invest in the futures, our communities have invested in non-emitting resources at Vogtle Units 3 and 4, but also have funded $500 million in state-of-the-art emission controls for our coal-generating resources. Just as with the existing nuclear, this proposal does not provide credit, in our view, for compliance for the new nuclear units and the community's billions of dollars in investment in these units. In fact, EPA treats this resource as a zero-cost resource in their economic analysis, which, of course, skews the results. We still have a great deal of investment to be put into these resources, so that's a flaw we see in their evaluation of the rule. The proposal would also require reduced coal unit operation. We've heard that, potentially even requiring shutdown of the units, which strands the cost of all these environmental investments. And our communities have to pay those costs. They have no ability to defer those costs to anyone else. They strictly go to our ratepayers. Each hour of the day, MEAG selects the lowest cost set of resources from our diverse mix, coal, nuclear, hydro, gas, in order to provide wholesale power to our communities. This principle of economic dispatch is the foundation of industry operation and allows for use of a diverse set of fuel and resources in a manner that ensures our citizens receive the benefit of their investment. This rule would result in environmental dispatch, which would limit our use of low-cost coal resources instead of economic dispatch, and thus it would raise the cost of power to all our communities. Reliable and competitive cost electric power is a key to economic development in this state. Our state energy costs have supported some key economic development successes, such as the location of Kia, Caterpillar, Baxter Pharmaceuticals, and this rule penalizes Georgia for our early action and requires us to do more than other states and impacts our ability to compete with other states for these new loads, especially those that have less aggressive goals, as was mentioned earlier, like Alabama and Tennessee. In summary, this proposal goes well beyond the requirements of Section 111D of the Clean Air Act and creates costs that will flow to our citizens in the communities we serve. As was mentioned by Representative Holmes, many of these citizens are low and fixed income and can least afford an increase in their electricity cost. The proposal penalizes Georgia for the steps we've already taken to provide a lower emissions and affordable electric system for our citizens and impacts our ability to compete for new jobs that are needed in the state. This proposal, in our view, should be withdrawn and replaced with a proposal based on the Clean Air Act and that actually can be implemented by the state under their current laws. Thank you for this opportunity to provide these comments. I appreciate your time today and would be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I don't see any questions. Thanks, sir. Appreciate it very much. We have one of our Public Service Commissioners, Tim Eccles. Did you wish to speak? Sure. And we're pretty much right on schedule, so we're good. And
thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've heard from Commissioner Wise. I just wanted to point out two things that really that I've been hearing from the EPA on these conference calls that I've been on with not only our region but other regions around the country, and I had a chance to meet with the regional administrator again this past weekend up in Brazelton when they were up with their team for the Petite Le Mans race at Road Atlanta. And there are two things that I know we need to continue to push for, and there are problems associated with this rule. One of them is something called behind-the-meter solar. You may know that we have companies like Purina, IKEA, others who have put solar on their facility. They're not in the Georgia Power ASI program. They're simply consuming the solar themselves to shave their peak. And the EPA, everyone that I've talked to, they have said, when I've asked, are we going to be able to count that in the formula? And they said, no, you will not be able to count it because there is no regulatory trigger. That's code for there's no renewable portfolio standard set up by your legislature. And so I don't want to be cynical about this rule, but to me, part of what they're trying to accomplish is browbeating states like Georgia into having a renewable portfolio standard, which frankly we don't need, and I certainly would never suggest or lobby to you that we do. Therefore, we need credit for that. And I made a trip to NREL, to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory 3 weeks ago to meet with the lab director to discuss this issue. And he gave us a couple of suggestions. One is to get the EMCs to include, every EMC to include in their annual report how much solar they already have in their system and to report on that every single year. And of course, EPD and GFA will make note of this in their annual compliance report. And then Georgia Power, I met with Paul Bowers 2 days ago and talked about the solution for them, and that is basically putting Georgia Power's solar into the IRP, which the Public Service Commission approves every 3 years. So this was one of my concerns because I felt like, on the one hand, EPA is telling us to do these things, and then they're being overly harsh and not allowing us to have credit for it, and having kind of a hypocritical, Mr. Chairman, double standard, if you will. So I'm concerned about that. And the second thing that I'm concerned about that I'm personally making a lot of noise about, and that is what you've heard about regarding our pine trees in this state. If you've ever been in a commercial greenhouse, you know that they pump CO2 into those greenhouses because plants like greenhouses, and guess what? Our pine trees that surround all of our plant facilities like CO2. It is part of their food, and we need to get credit for those pine trees as something that mitigates our CO2. And I don't know whether it's going to be 0.5%, 1%, but there's studies out there that I'm talking about and that other folks from the universities are talking about, and we just need to make sure that we get credit for these things. But I just wanted to let you know that utility executives, the EPD, GFA, the Georgia Public Service Commission, we're thinking about this every day, and I think we're all going to have to work together to try to decrease the pain that this is going to be for our state. And certainly, I'm still hopeful that a new president might change his or her mind on this and not force us to do these things that are going to have such an adverse impact on our state. But I thank you for taking the time, Mr. Chairman, to have this hearing and to hear more about it, because we need everyone in our state on board in fighting against the difficulties associated with this rule. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. You made some very good points we hadn't heard before. Thank you. Appreciate it. And I didn't see any questions. We'll call on Colleen Kiernan from Sierra Club.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. My name is Colleen Kiernan. I'm the director of the Georgia chapter of the Sierra Club. And y'all are probably much more familiar with our legislative team, Neil Herring and Mark Woodall. And Mark Woodall is here in the room. And we have several members of our energy committee here. The Sierra Club is a membership organization. We're mostly volunteer-driven. We are over 100,000 of your friends and neighbors and family members across the state of Georgia. And we're here because we care about the future of our planet and for future generations, for our children and our children's children. And I think that Chief Cochran provided a really good presentation of why we're really here today. And I'm really pleased that in the last 5 years in this state we've stopped debating climate science, and we seem to be at least accepting that rules are, EPA does have the authority to regulate climate pollution, and the state of Georgia is going to need to figure out how best to deal with this rule and implement it to the best effect for Georgians in order to protect us and take advantage of the opportunities that this rule presents. And I'm an optimist, and I think this rule presents us with a lot of really great opportunities. I want to just quickly address a lot of what we've heard this morning about the fact that we're not getting credit for certain things. I think that's just the wrong way to look at it. And as an optimist, I look at it as, we have an opportunity here. Rather than we're not getting credit for Vogel or we're not getting credit for the things that we're already doing, EPA has acknowledged that, and the numbers that we saw from the presentations by EPD are such that, without doing anything else, we could sit on our hands, and we are halfway to our goal already. So this idea that we have unfair goals and Alabama has to do less and Tennessee has to do less, we are already halfway there, and so what we still have to do is about the same as our neighbors. And if there was any other thing in the world where we were this far ahead of our neighbors, if we had been creating more jobs than Alabama, if we had, had more solar companies than our friends in North Carolina, we would be excited. We would understand and embrace the opportunity, and we would say, we're already so far ahead. How can we seize this and go get more? And that's the opportunity that I think we should be talking about today. So, and I would like, at some point, the opportunity to address the blue coal points, but I came prepared today to talk about the state of Georgia, so I'm going to save those comments for another day. The Sierra Club has analyzed this rule and the targets for Georgia fairly extensively, and I've listened, to the Oglethorpe and the MEAG and the Georgia Power presentations, and I think we're actually a lot closer. And Sierra Club and Greenlaw, our partners, have been participating in the stakeholders group along with several of our other coalition partners. And I think we're more on the same page than you might believe. So I think the real opportunity that we have is, our analysis that we have shared with EPD, GFA, and the Public Service Commission is that Georgia can meet all of the rest of what we need to do for this rule with renewables and efficiency. And that is a huge opportunity for us to develop great jobs in Georgia as well as keep our energy economy strong. So I just want to kind of walk through how that happens. And I brought the letter. I saw that you didn't want to pass that information out. There's a chart in here I would like to refer to, but if you don't want to pass it out, I can just talk through it. So I'm just going to read through parts of it. If you want to pass that out, that's great. If not, no worries. So Georgia's economic competitiveness relies on sound resources decisions in the power sector. This sector bears a substantial portion of the costs of weather-related losses, which we heard from Chief Cochran about, and contributes a substantial portion of the underlying climate-disrupting pollution. The stakes are very high for Georgia. Left unchecked, climate change impacts could cost the state as much as $103 billion over 752,000 jobs between 2010 and 2050. Fortunately, we've made progress towards modernizing our power sector and protecting Georgia families and businesses from the costs and risks of the power sector pollution through the retirement of some of our oldest and dirtiest coal units and the addition of energy efficiency, solar, and wind power. We have reduced our air, land, and water pollution and their costly impacts already. Georgia has every reason to continue this transition to clean, modern energy resources through additional investments in energy efficiency, solar, and wind power. Solar resources are cost competitive, they've been added to our system in record numbers in recent years, and they've created thousands of jobs across Georgia and the U.S. In addition, these clean, modern resources save Georgians money, enhance grid resilience and reliability, and prepare the power sector for tightening pollution regulations, including the Clean Power Plan, but also other things, like upcoming tightening of our national ambient air quality standards. But in contrast, conventional coal, gas, and nuclear power plants require huge, inflexible capital outlays that bind Georgians to buying out-of-state fuel and installing incremental pollution controls at a cost of over $1.8 billion in 2012 alone.
Ms. Karen, can I interrupt just for a second? I myself have trouble with certain inflections.
Okay.
You can slow down a little bit if you want
All
to.
right.
You don't. I mean, and the reason we certainly want the information that you have.
Okay.
I just wanted to give it out at the end, or whenever the members leave, just so we don't we're all trying to look through a lot of different and we appreciate it, but that's the only thing. But you can slow down some. I myself have a little bit of trouble if the
That's totally fair.
Conversation is too quick. The speech is too quick of hearing all the different.
So I was a member of Emory University's distinguished Barclay Forum debate team, so I have a bad habit of getting up here and wanting to go as fast as possible.
We want to hear what you have to say.
So I apologize for that.
And I
bad
didn't mean to be
habit.
rude. I just want to make sure that
No, thank you for slowing me down. I appreciate it. Anyway, Georgia has, so we have the potential to advance energy efficiency, solar power, and wind power that will help reduce those supply side costs and risks, which will help enhance Georgia's economy and welfare. Okay, so here's where I'm going to explain how we can meet the rest of what we have to do for the Clean Power Plan with just retiring a few more of our coal plants and investing in energy efficiency and renewable energy. Okay, so first of all, so we've talked a little bit about the target, so I'm going to skip through this part. So our target is 834 pounds per megawatt hour. And so we've heard EPD wants to loosen that to 900 and whatever the number was. But I think that we should, this is important for our families and our future, and we can do this, and we have to do this. And it's an opportunity. It's not going to be pain. We can do this, and it's going to be good for us. Okay. I'm just going to skip through. Okay. So, all right, Georgia's in-state energy efficiency and renewable energy potential is substantial, and by conservative estimates can achieve 100% compliance with the Clean Power Plan. Georgia should prioritize these clean, modern resources and start preparing now to use cost-effective energy efficiency wind and solar to the fullest extent. Our assessment reflects conservative estimates of renewable energy and energy efficiency gains through 2030, specifically 10% renewable, so that's solar and wind penetration. Analysis in the Clean Power Plan, this analysis assumes that renewable energy and energy efficiency actually displace sources that emit carbon pollution. Based on this assumption, so this is what Dr. Shelton was explaining earlier. So EPA basically did a straw man proposal to figure out what our limits should be, but we can do whatever the heck we want. So what we did when we analyzed this information is we said, can efficiency and renewables displace some of the coal and natural gas that EPA looked at? So when you heard from Georgia Power that said, when they were saying we can't do 6% efficiency at our plants, we say, okay, fine, we don't have to, because we can do everything we need to do with renewables and efficiency. So based on this assumption and these conservative estimates, Georgia could achieve 100% compliance with the Clean Power Plan targets as illustrated in the figure on page 4. So when you get the letter, that's where it is. There's a little chart that shows it. So the first thing that we need to do is retire a couple more coal plants. And these are 2 plants that don't run very often already. And so when we talked about, coal plants aren't good for taking your foot off the pedal, they're good for the long haul highway driving, they're not good for city driving. So Plant Hammond and Plant McIntosh are not used very much. They haven't been used very much in recent years anyway, but they have not been announced for retirement yet. So, in order to meet other rules like the Mercury rule, Georgia Power is going to have to invest a fair amount retrofitting those plants. So instead of putting additional stranded costs into those coal plants, we're saying go ahead and retire them, and that will account for, that'll get us to 33% of our additional goal, a third more of what we need to do. So we're at, 1,186 pounds per megawatt hour without doing anything else, and we need to get to 834. So a third of that can be done by retiring Plant Hammond and Plant McIntosh. The second thing is to ramp up energy efficiency. Now, this is the most exciting opportunity that we have. This is what Georgia Tech will tell you is our biggest opportunity. They've analyzed it. The folks at South Face are great. They'll tell you that the cheapest and cleanest kilowatt hour is the one that we never produce. This is where jobs are created. This is where our construction workers get put back to work. This is the best opportunity we have for Georgia. Okay, so on the conservative end, EPA estimates that Georgia can start ramping up its investments in energy efficiency by 2017 and achieve annual savings equal to 1.5% of retail sales by 2024. The analysis presented here uses these conservative EPA estimates. However, by matching top-performing states with annual savings equal to 2% of retail sales, Georgia has even more to gain, both in terms of reaching its Clean Power Plan targets and reinvesting in the local economy. Georgia's potential to rapidly and profitably match the top-performing states on energy efficiency is well documented in studies performed over the past 10 years. For example, GFA's last technical potential study found that Georgia has the potential to save 29% of its retail sales, which is approximately as much potential as top-performing states. That means that Georgia has untapped potential to save energy and money through simple, low-cost measures that are widely applicable to homes and businesses. Similarly, spurring widespread consumer participation in such measures and programs has enabled the high-performing states to accomplish tremendous savings and gain a wide range of non-energy benefits, which I'll describe in a minute. So Gulf Power has done even better than Georgia Power, and so we can use them as a model. They've saved already in 2013 almost a full %. And so we can, Georgia Southern Company's sister company has experience, and they are doing these programs well, and we can and should be doing those here in Georgia. Energy efficiency is the most widely available and lowest cost option for reducing carbon emissions. On average, energy efficiency programs now cost 2.8 cents per kilowatt hour, and costs are continuing to fall. EPA found that the average cost of carbon reductions achieved from energy efficiency measures ranged from $16 to $24 per metric ton of carbon dioxide. In comparison, natural gas redispatch cost forecasts are on average $30 per metric ton of carbon dioxide. Even the conservative savings ramp up modeled in EPA's energy efficiency building block would reduce average electric bills by as much as 9% by 2030. So Representative Holmes, I heard you when you were concerned about the seniors and their electric bills. So I'm saying that even this plan, if we choose the right path to meet it, can actually save our consumers money rather than cause any pain or add on any additional costs than what we're already paying for things like the new nuclear units at Vogtle, et cetera. So energy efficiency has already positively impacted Georgia's economy and will continue to do so once more energy efficiency measures are incorporated. These economic benefits are also called non-energy benefits, and those are from growing an energy efficient economy, and they're widely recognized. So sustained job growth and increased productivity for homes and businesses. For example, there are both direct and indirect job benefits related to energy efficiency. Jobs are created that relate directly to the implementation of the programs, so in construction, maintenance, manufacturing, and consulting industries, and the bill savings keep consumer dollars in the local economy, which spurs indirect job growth in other industries. All right, so then there are a number of programs that we list. I'm not going to walk through all of them, but GFA is very familiar with these programs. The Public Service Commission is very familiar with these programs, and EPD is becoming familiar with these programs, but they have great potential. I'm going to jump forward to the renewable energy piece. So this is the last building block that we think that we should use because it's the other really exciting economic potential for Georgia. So increasing electricity generation from renewable sources is the other achievable and cost-effective compliance strategy that Georgia should pursue. In developing state-specific emissions targets, EPA assumed that states would increase renewable generating capacity over time through state-level renewable generation targets based on an average of a renewable portfolio standard for 6 predefined regions. So for Georgia, EPA assumed that Georgia could achieve a 10% target by 2030. This estimate is reasonable and actually perhaps low because of Georgia's above-average solar resources, ability to import wind, and state wind resources. And I don't know if Commissioner Eccles got a chance to talk to the NREL president when he was out there, but the new numbers for Georgia in-state wind, we used to think we didn't have any, but we have the potential for over 3 gigawatts onshore in Georgia. That's going to create jobs. We already have huge manufacturing opportunities in Gainesville, Georgia. We could be doing even better. So we've already begun to embrace wind and solar resources. As you know, we have almost 1 gigawatt coming online. We have 250 megawatts that we're bringing in from Oklahoma, and we have the potential to expand much greater. and I mean, the reason that we're doing the 250 megawatts from Oklahoma is because it was way cheaper. It's putting downward pressure on our rates. So the opportunity to embrace a lot more of this is going to be great for consumers. All right, I think I'm just going to, all the rest of these details are in here. I'm not going to go any further, but we think this is a great opportunity for Georgia. We really appreciate this, the chairman's and this committee's interest in this issue, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. You do have a question if you'd like to take
Great.
it. I'm not sure who's at desk 84. Somebody out there have a question? Well then, okay, let me get you then. Representative Carson, what number are you at? Let's see, this is 4, I think. Or no, 2.
Thank you. I appreciate your testimony. I wanted to clarify one thing. The reason Georgia Power purchased that power coming in from Oklahoma had to do with the tax credits. It had nothing to do with the economics of solar power as it of itself. Can we agree on that?
Solar power or wind power?
The wind power, I'm sorry.
It's true that there was a federal production tax credit that has since expired, but wind is beating any other resource in Texas and Oklahoma, and it will continue to be cheaper.
Well, it's the tax credits, really. It's the tax credits that make these economical, not the renewable energy itself.
I don't agree with that point, no.
What is your background?
I majored in political science and environmental studies at Emory University, and I have a master's in city and regional planning with a specialization on environmental management from Georgia Tech.
Have you ever worked in the energy industry?
I'm a LEED accredited professional, but I have not worked in the energy industry.
In all due respect, you're quoting lots of statistics and telling us we're going to take
Sure.
all the coal power plants offline and so forth. And you're talking about all the benefits of doing so. I heartily disagree, and I wonder how qualified you are to attest to taking billions of dollars of infrastructure off the grid and saying it's an opportunity to reinvest elsewhere. Well, that reinvest comes from investing, which is spending, which is taking money from the consumers and higher rates. How do you feel about that?
Well, to address your credibility question, I hope my letter will be passed out. It's very well documented and footnoted. But to answer the question about consumers, I mean, it's just a question of where you're applying the resources on the front end or the back end. And when you invest in an energy efficiency program, you are investing in the front end to save, exponentially on the back end. And it's our position that that's going to help Georgia in terms of both consumers' pocketbooks as well as, all of the impacts that Chief Cochran talked about in terms of emergency response and weather-related disasters. I mean, we're paying for climate disruption.
We're going to be paying a lot more under your plan.
I just explained how we're not. It's going to be cheaper. Energy efficiency is going to drive our power bills down 9%. If we address the Clean Power Plan in the best way for Georgia by embracing renewables and efficiency, our power bills can get lower. It's an opportunity for Georgia.
I believe that's a theory, not evidence in economic reality.
I can't wait for you to read my letter.
Thank you, Representative Carson. I don't see any further questions. Thank you very much. We appreciate you coming and appreciate your testimony. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. We are on schedule, and we're just about, but what's your number there? Got a number? Request to speak? Okay, I see it there. I think you're on. Well, you're not on, but.
Great. We can all hear you, Representative Martin.
It's on, I think.
I just a question, and not to get into the economics or who's cheaper. I mean, that's a debate for a later time. I look forward to reading your letter. The question I have, I just returned from Denver, where we had natural gas. We had a number of people who went. Are you familiar with any state that's replacing base load with wind?
I mean, Iowa is getting well over 20% of its electricity from wind.
Are they counting that as base load? I understand
Yeah.
on demand.
Well, here's. Well, I think that we're gonna, as far as a big picture answer to that, base load is not going to be a thing of the future. That's like, that would be like 30 years ago if you're like, what are we going to do without the mainframe computers? It's like, You know, that's the direction where we're going. Our entire utility system is going through a huge renaissance, and baseload isn't going to be a question that you're going to ask in 10 years.
Well, with due respect, I mean, the way I ask baseload, and clearly things are changing. Distributed generation, one argument when I think the economy will evolve, the electrical generation economy will evolve. But I find it hard to believe, baseload is the need for electricity when people wake up in the morning and turn it on. Or I just returned from a visit to a hospital when the people need the electricity to run the respirators in the hospital. That's base load that you have to have all the time. I fail to see there be the electric situation where base load would be. And you may have the answer may be some states may count on wind for base load. I'm not aware of any, so I was asking the question, are you aware where anybody is replacing base load with wind? Because I'd like to talk to the commissioners for this.
Great, yes, the entire middle of the country. And mainframe computers, now we have computers in our pockets, and that's what's going to happen.
Okay, listen, I'm gonna go ahead and interrupt you. I'm going to invoke my chairmanship. We can finish up here on time, and I want to try to give every member of the committee a chance to express their feelings or whatever about this issue. And we appreciate you coming very much. Really do. Thank you. Thank you. And I mean no disrespect, members of the committee. I would say this before next speaker. Of course, obviously, we can't change. We can't change what the EPA has proposed. If it goes into effect, we can't change that. The state of Georgia is going to follow the law, I'm sure, whatever happens. But what we're trying to do is be informed on what is before the state, not necessarily before this committee, but before the state. And Chairman Martin said a while ago, which I didn't know, that the comment period has been extended to sometime in December. So there's still plenty of time. If any member of the committee or anybody in here that has not submitted testimony to the EPA, you still have that opportunity to do that. I submitted mine some time ago, and I'm glad that I did take that opportunity. Dr. Young, are you here? There you are. Dr. Walter Young, I spoke with Dr. Walter Young a couple of weeks ago, and he wanted an opportunity. I wanted him to have the opportunity to come up, and I think he has something he would like to present to us. Dr. Young, if you would introduce yourself and kind of tell us a little bit about who you are and why you're here, we would appreciate it.
Chairman Parsons, members of the committee, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. I'm Dr. Walter Young, and I'm a dentist, and I guess you wonder why I'm up here. Well, I've been practicing about 55 years, and people say I'm a little too old, but my hands are good, my eyes are good, and my blood pressure is good, my blood sugar's good, and I'm in good shape. So I think I have a lot left to offer America. And you wonder how I got interested in this energy discussion. Well, most of my patients are in the range of pre-tax income of $50,000. I have a lot of Medicaid patients, a lot of poor people. And I've always sort of been identified with the poor people and the voiceless people. Years ago, I was practicing in Louisiana, and I was involved in the civil rights movement, and I met Dr. King, and we became very close, and he says, Walter, why don't you come to Atlanta and work with me in the SCLC, and I want you to be the poor people's dentist. And back in those days, they didn't have any benefits programs for poor people, so I became a poor people's dentist, and I'm still practicing. But I want to represent the voiceless, those people that we forget about when decisions are made in the federal government and in the state government. And more than 100 Americans qualify for federal government low-income home energy assistance program. I'm not here to address the impact of these regulations on the climate. That is an area outside my expertise, but as a lifelong civil rights activist and advocate on behalf of the voiceless, I'm here today to address these regulations, how these regulations will affect low-income and fixed-income Americans, in particular, how they will disproportionately affect men, women, and children. I understand that these regulations will shut down most coal plants in the country and prevent the opening of any new ones for the foreseeable future. By removing the cheapest and most plentiful source of electricity, study confirms people across the country will see their energy and their utility bills go up. This may be a sacrifice many are willing to make, but I'm here to testify that on behalf of those who can't afford that kind of sacrifice and whose voices have been drowned out by the debate. An increase in 30% of my utility bill probably won't hurt me and my income, but for 100 million Americans who are already struggling to keep their lights on, 30% increase will force more to seek assistance or make extremely difficult decisions between buying electricity for their homes or food and medicine for their families. I want the committee to urge the FDA and the administration to delay the implementation of these regulations until we better understand the harmful effects of low and fixed-income Americans. We cannot afford to leave anyone behind, especially in the name of progress. The Afro-American community is even divided over this issue. The NAACP is with the EPA, and the National Black Chamber of Commerce is on the other hand, again, supports a delay in the implementation of these regulations. We need to delay or stop implementation of these regulations until we better understand the social implications. Let me give you a summary of my findings. This report analyzes consumer energy cost increases since 2001 for all U.S. households and examines the pattern of energy expenditures among 4 income levels and for senior and minority families in 2012. It relies on historical energy consumption survey data and current energy price forecasts from the U.S. Department of Energy's Information Administration. Energy costs are summarized in nominal dollars by household income category for U.S. households in 2001, 2005, and 2012. Using data from EIA and the U.S. Department of Census, energy prices projections for 2012 are based on DOE and EIA, short-term energy outlook released in January 2012. Key findings are, in 2012, the median household income in the U.S. families was $49,500. Slightly more than half of U.S. households have average pre-tax incomes below $50,000. What does that say? That says that most of Americans, half of Americans are living on incomes of $50,000 and less pre-tax incomes. These are the people that I work with and I talk to every day. Most of these people, they don't have insurance. They can't even pay a co-payment to come to see the doctor. Family incomes have not kept pace with the rising cost of energy. Since 2007, the U.S. Census Bureau reports the real median household income has declined from 60% and is 77% below median household and peak incomes. Poverty rates have increased to historic heights along with the declining long-term trend in family incomes. The number of people in poverty in 2010 was the largest number in 52 years since the Census Bureau began to publish poverty statistics. Poverty is more prevalent among some minority groups. Some 27% of blacks and 26% of Hispanics lived in poverty in 2010, compared with 15% of overall population. Higher gasoline prices account for nearly 4/5 of the increased cost of energy for consumers. However, electricity is a bargain among consumer energy products. It's the cheapest form of energy that we have. Virtually all residential electricity price increases over the past 2 decades have occurred in year 2000. Increases are due in part to additional capital, operating, and maintenance costs associated with meeting clean air and environmental standards. Lower income families are more vulnerable to energy costs than higher income families because energy represents a large portion of their household budget. Energy is consuming 1/5 or more of the household increases of lower and middle class families. In 2010, 62% Hispanic households and 68% black households had annual incomes below $50,000, compared with 46% of white households and 39% Asian households. Fixed income seniors are growing proportionally in the U.S. population and are among vulnerable to energy and cost increases due to the relatively low average incomes. In 2010, the median gross income of 25.4 million households with principal householder getting 65 years and older was $31,000, 36% below the national income. I think these findings will stimulate some of your thinking and try to readdress some of the goals that you've established, and I trust that you will seriously consider redefining some of the proposals that the EPA has made, and I trust that you'll allow me to continue to work with you and to support the work that you're doing. And thank you very much for...
Thank you, Dr. Young. Appreciate you coming very, very much. I don't see any questions. Thank you. We have the Georgia Chamber of Commerce here, Doug Meal, if you would come up, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Doug Mile. I'm representing the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, and I have responsibility for crafting the Chamber's energy and natural resources policy and responses to issues such as those that we are addressing today. At the outset, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to this important issue. It is one that we've heard this morning is going to create some challenges for the state to address. And I'd also like to start by stating that the Chamber expresses its strong support for our energy and generation distribution members, who through all weather and demand extremes do a fantastic job of providing reliable, high-quality energy supplies for the state's businesses, industries and communities. At the Chamber, we understand that our members share one important requirement: the need for reliable and affordable energy. It is a major key to Georgia's competitiveness and success, and underpins our business investment, employment growth, and enviable living standards. The Chamber seeks to preserve this advantage for Georgia and its communities, and therefore does not support EPA's decision to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. The Chamber supports market-based development of energy generation capabilities, of which coal-fueled generation is an important component. Currently, the development and management of the state's energy generation and distribution systems is carefully planned to stimulate required investment, provide supply certainty and reliability, and minimise, to the maximum extent possible, upward pressure on consumer prices. EPA's regulatory processes must preserve these principles. As we've heard this morning, Georgia has already achieved significant emissions reductions through combined actions of utilities, regulators and consumers. This demonstrates that ongoing change can be achieved without driving the state's economy into a ditch or forcing consumers to bear the burden of inevitable price increases, not only in power prices, but all manner of goods and services they rely on to underpin their quality of life. Data in the 2014 Georgia Energy Report reveals that in recent years, Georgia has significantly changed its energy generation mix and its carbon emissions by fuel switching, utility investments and consumption efficiencies. This can be attributed to a combination of market forces, regulatory stimulation and consumer behaviour, and all achieved during a period of protracted slow national economic recovery, and without a debilitating Clean Power Plan. Our state is a prime example of what can be done when providers have the opportunity to identify the solutions that make the most sense, not only for them, but also for the consumers and communities they serve. We can also learn a cheap lesson from the recent Australian carbon tax experience. During its 2-year lifespan, that carbon tax slugged businesses and industries $9 billion per year. Power prices skyrocketed, and all for minuscule, barely measurable reductions in emissions. Businesses were hit with a tax that their international competitors did not have. Some closed, others shifted offshore, many struggled to survive and prosper. Clearly, taxation and heavy-handed regulation are not the panacea to achieving meaningful reductions in carbon emissions. This pathway, delivered at best symbolic emissions reductions, place an undue burden on consumers and clearly illustrates the economic uncertainty that faces the US economy if EPA's Clean Power Plan is implemented as currently proposed. It is not a pathway the Chamber wants to see imposed in Georgia. As has been demonstrated here in Georgia, it is indeed possible to achieve meaningful environmental outcomes while maintaining affordable prices without subjecting the economy to draconian measures that will hit business and consumer confidence, stall business investment, and hinder employment growth. Rural consumers are likely to be hardest hit in this scenario and have the least ability to cope with any power price increases. The Chamber believes that EPA's actions must allow the states ample time to perform their rightful roles and rulemaking authorities. We are concerned that EPA appears to be rushing to achieve an arbitrary deadline without fully considering state-specific options. And individual Chamber members are very concerned that EPA's actions will undermine the reliability and affordability of their energy supplies, potentially impacting their business profitability and competitiveness. Our Chamber absolutely agrees that Georgia's natural beauty and quality of life are resources that should be protected. But we also believe that can be done in a way that does not risk our ability to create jobs, encourage investment, and maintain the globally competitive status we have all worked so hard to create. Mr. Chairman, in closing, the Chamber shares the concerns articulated this morning by Commissioner Wise, our industry colleagues, and acknowledges the scope of the challenges this rule raises as outlined by EPD, and indeed even as outlined by the Speaker of the Sierra Club. There are a lot of opportunities here that we all need to be carefully considering and explore. But we do implore EPD to take the needs of our individual states and economies into consideration before finalising the rules as proposed in its Clean Power Plan. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any questions. Thank you very much for coming. The time is almost up. There's only one more person who signed up. Daniel Blackman, who is that? If you can make it really, really short, I mean, you can either do this. I'm going to give you like 2 minutes, and I hate to even say that, but this is something I'd said at the beginning. I will be glad to stay, or any other members, after we conclude here in a few minutes, and we'll listen to whatever you have to say. Either I'll give you that option. I'll give you those two different options. Okay. And I don't mean to be rude. I just people have meetings to go to and lunches to eat.
Yeah, I don't have a choice to be quick. I've got to read to my son's class in Forsyth County in about 45 minutes, so I'll be brief. And I'll try not to put anyone to sleep. I guess to summarize what I'd like to say is
tell us who you are and who
Daniel Blackman. I'm the Democratic nominee for Public Service Commission in the state of Georgia.
Okay, it's going to be real quick.
I will be quick, I guarantee. So I will limit my comments to the portion on why I just believe this is such an important rule and such an important step for Georgia. I respect each and every one of the comments that were made today, and I'll open up by saying that I think the Public Service Commission as well as Georgia Power did the right thing earlier or later last year with them accepting 525 megawatts of solar into our mix. But today I want to speak a little bit about why I believe this is important. And again, I'll be quick. But
okay, one minute.
In 1 minute. But what I'll do, because I do feel rushed, I'll submit my comments directly to you because it seems like it's being rushed through.
And I do apologize if it weren't for the time limit, and of course, you are a candidate, so we have to be mindful of that also. Be glad to get your testimony in writing, and not intending to be rude whatsoever. We have just a few minutes left. I want to, most of the members have been, well, really all the members have been sitting here listening and very courteously. And I heard a pastor say years ago something I always kind of remembered. He says, how was it? Impression without expression causes depression. I don't want anybody to be depressed by not being able to express themselves. Chairman Geisinger, do you have any comments you'd like to make? Representative Holmes? Anybody?
I think I said it.
Okay. Get to a mic. So you need to be, this being a webcast, so let me see if I can get you on here. I don't know if I can. Push your button again. Okay, you want to come up here?
Just to the members of the committee and the people in the audience, I had an appointment. I had to get to a hospital, and I did my best to get back. But we may not always agree on this, but I'm currently chair of the Council of State Government's Energy and Environment Committee. I've spent the summer in a number of different cities listening to a lot of different testimony on this. And whether we agree or disagree on if this is a good rule, if it should be implemented now, if it should be implemented later, we have until December 1st to make our comments. And I think we're all better served if those comments are made. So thank you for coming out today. Make those comments. Keep your voices heard. And let's stick to the things that make sense to us for Georgia as we move forward. And Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to thank you for having this meeting in front of the December 1st deadline. I think it's very important that Georgia goes on record and all those citizens of Georgia do the same.
Thank you. Anybody else? I guess that's it. I want to thank everybody for coming. The public, we have a good turnout. Members of the committee, thank you all for being here and sitting here patiently. I think this is a very important issue, and appreciate all the input. And with that, meeting's adjourned.